Carl Jung explained, 12 spiritual shifts you experience when the old self breaks free. There's a truth about human transformation that most spiritual teachers won't tell you. Not because they don't know it, but because once you understand it, there's no going back to the comfortable illusions that keep most people safely imprisoned in lives they don't even recognize as cages. Carl Jung discovered something that terrified the psychological establishment of his time, something that still threatens the foundations of how we think about self-improvement, spirituality, and what it means to become who you really are. He found that the breakthrough you've been seeking, the liberation you've been praying for, the freedom you've been chasing through therapy, meditation, self-help books, and spiritual practices, this very breakthrough is experienced by your ego as nothing less than death itself. And that's exactly why you keep sabotaging it. Think about that for a moment. The part of you that wants to be free is not the same part of you that runs your daily life. The consciousness that longs for authenticity is not the constructed self that gets you through your day, that manages your relationships, that maintains your social acceptability, that keeps you employed and respected and safe. That constructed self, what Jung called the persona combined with ego identifications, has spent your entire life building an identity, a story about who you are, and it will do absolutely anything to maintain that story, even if that story is killing you from the inside. This is the forbidden truth that changes everything. Genuine spiritual transformation isn't about becoming a better version of who you are. It's not about improving the self, fixing the self, or evolving the self. It's about the complete death and dismemberment of the false identity you've been maintaining since childhood. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." And he meant anything. People will stay in toxic relationships rather than face who they've become. They'll remain in careers that crush their spirit rather than confront the question of what they actually want. They'll maintain beliefs that contradict their lived experience rather than undergo the disorientation of not knowing. They'll defend behaviors they know are destructive rather than see themselves clearly. Why? Because the alternative, the genuine encounter with your authentic self, requires the ego to surrender its tyrannical control over your consciousness. And to the ego, surrender feels like annihilation. This is why society, religion, even mainstream psychology are often designed, whether consciously or unconsciously, to keep you trapped in the old self. Because free, individuated beings cannot be controlled. They cannot be manipulated. They cannot be programmed. They cannot be sold identities, ideologies, or solutions to problems they don't actually have. A person who has broken free from the constructed self and encountered their authentic nature becomes unpredictable, ungovernable, and absolutely dangerous to systems that depend on unconscious compliance. And you can feel this, can't you? You can feel how the culture pressures you back into your assigned role whenever you start to break free, how your family subtly punishes you for changing, how your friends become uncomfortable when you stop playing the character they've come to expect, how institutions pathologize your transformation as breakdown, rebellion, or mental illness when it's actually breakthrough. What I'm about to share with you are the 12 unmistakable shifts that occur when the old self finally begins to break free. These aren't metaphors. They're not abstract philosophical concepts. They're concrete, recognizable, often terrifying experiences that signal your psyche is liberating itself from the prison of conditioning. And recognizing these shifts is absolutely essential, because when they begin, and if you're watching this, they may have already begun, your ego will try to convince you that you're going crazy, that you're falling apart, that you're making terrible mistakes, that you need to get back to normal, back to who you were, back to the safe predictability of the constructed self. But what's actually happening is the most important transformation of your existence. The false self is dying so the true self can finally live. And understanding these 12 shifts is your roadmap through the process, your confirmation that what feels like breakdown is actually breakthrough, your evidence that you're not losing your mind. You're losing your mind's grip on a false identity. The question is, are you ready to know what these shifts are? Are you prepared to recognize them in your own experience? Because once you see them, once you understand what's happening, you'll have to make a choice. You'll have to decide whether to regress back into the comfortable prison of who you've been told to be, or to stay conscious through the death of the old self and the birth of the authentic you. This isn't a path of comfort. Jung never promised you comfort. He promised you consciousness. He promised you reality. He promised you your actual life instead of the performance you've been giving for an audience that was never really paying attention anyway. So let me ask you directly, have you begun to experience these shifts? Has your old identity started to crack? Have you felt the terror of not knowing who you are anymore? Comment below and let me know, because this is where the real journey begins. Not in some distant future of enlightenment, but right here, right now, in the uncomfortable, disorienting, absolutely necessary dissolution of everything you thought you knew about yourself. Let's begin. Before we can understand how the old self breaks free, we need to understand exactly what the old self is. And this is where most people's understanding of psychology, spirituality, and personal growth goes catastrophically wrong. Because the identity you think is you, the self you wake up with every morning, the I that thinks these thoughts and makes these decisions, this isn't actually you at all. It's a construction, a fabrication, an elaborate costume assembled piece by piece from the moment you were born until this very second, stitched together from materials you didn't choose, designed by architects you never met, built to specifications you never agreed to. Carl Jung called this the persona, combined with what he termed ego identifications. But that clinical language doesn't capture the profound tragedy of what's actually happened to you. The truth is, from birth, you've been systematically programmed to construct a false self. And by adulthood, this fabricated identity feels so real, so solid, so obviously you, that you mistake it for your actual self. Let me show you exactly how this happens. You emerge into this world as pure potential, a consciousness without fixed identity, a being capable of becoming anything. And immediately, before you can speak, before you can think, before you can even recognize yourself in a mirror, the programming begins. Your parents, unconsciously working from their own conditioning, start telling you who you are. She's the quiet one. He's so energetic. This one's sensitive. That one's strong. These aren't observations, they're assignments. They're the first bricks in the prison wall. And you, in your helpless dependency, accept these definitions as reality. You learn to perform the role that generates parental approval, because parental approval means survival. Then comes cultural conditioning. You're taught what it means to be a boy or a girl, what's appropriate for your race, your class, your nationality. You absorb the collective programming about success, about relationships, about what makes a life worth living. These aren't your values. They're downloaded into your psyche like software you never knew you were running. Religious programming adds another layer. Who you should be to please God, to earn salvation, to be good, to be worthy. You internalize entire belief systems about morality, meaning, and your place in the cosmic order. Belief systems that may have nothing to do with your actual experience of reality, but everything to do with controlling your behavior and consciousness. Educational indoctrination teaches you that certain kinds of intelligence matter while others don't, that certain ways of thinking are correct while others are wrong, That success means this specific thing and failure means that. You learn to measure yourself against external standards that were themselves constructed by systems with their own agendas. Media influence bombards you with images of who you should be, what you should want, how you should look, what you should achieve. You compare yourself to these impossible standards and find yourself lacking, never realizing that the standards themselves are fabricated to keep you consuming, seeking, buying solutions to problems that were manufactured specifically to sell you those solutions. Peer pressure adds its weight. You learn which parts of yourself generate acceptance and which generate rejection. You develop an exquisite sensitivity to social feedback, constantly adjusting your presentation to maximize approval and minimize exclusion. You become a performing self, always on stage, always being evaluated, never just being. And trauma, perhaps the most insidious architect of all, adds its contribution. When something overwhelms your capacity to process it, you don't just store the memory. You create an adaptive strategy, a way of being in the world that protects you from ever being that vulnerable again. You become the strong one who never needs help, the quiet one who never causes problems, the funny one who deflects through humor, the successful one who proves their worth through achievement. These trauma responses harden into identity. The protective adaptations become who you think you are. And decades later, long after the original threat has passed, you're still maintaining a defensive posture that no longer serves you, but which feels like your fundamental nature. By adulthood, all these layers have fused into what feels like a solid, coherent identity. You know exactly who you are. You can describe yourself. I'm an introvert. I'm a Christian. I'm a mother. I'm an engineer. I'm someone who values honesty. I'm someone who doesn't do conflict. I'm the responsible one in my family. But here's what Jung understood that almost everyone misses. These aren't descriptions of your authentic self. They're descriptions of your constructed self. The composite persona you've assembled to survive and function in a world that never asked who you actually were. This constructed self operates like a prison with invisible bars. You can't see the walls because you're looking through them. They manifest as limiting beliefs that feel like truth. I'm not creative. I'm bad with money. I can't trust people. I need to be in control. These aren't facts about reality. They're constraints of your programming. But because you've never questioned them, they function as the boundaries of your possible experience. Emotional patterns that feel like personality. I'm an anxious person. I tend to get depressed in winter. I'm quick to anger. I don't really feel things deeply. These aren't your true emotional nature. They're conditioned responses, learned ways of processing experience that have become automatic. But because they've been there so long, you identify with them. Behavioral programs that feel like choice. I always procrastinate. I'm a perfectionist. I need everything planned out. I go with the flow. These aren't your conscious decisions. They're unconscious patterns, running on autopilot. But because you're the one executing them, you experience them as your preferences, relationship dynamics that feel like love. I'm attracted to unavailable people. I always end up taking care of everyone. I need a lot of space in relationships. I lose myself in partnerships. These aren't expressions of your authentic relating capacity. They're reenactments of early attachment patterns, trauma bonds, and unconscious complexes. But because they're familiar, they feel like truth. And here's the devastating revelation that Jung confronted directly. Most people live their entire lives never once encountering their authentic self. They're born, they're programmed, they perform the constructed identity, and they die as complete strangers to their own soul. They wake up at 45, 55, 65, and feel a vague sense that they've been living someone else's life. They look back at their choices and wonder, Did I actually want any of this? Or was I just following a script I didn't know I was reading? They've achieved all the goals they were told to achieve and feel nothing. Empty. Hollow. Success without satisfaction. Accomplishment without meaning. Jung recognized this as the epidemic of our age. Millions upon millions of people suffering from a case of mistaken identity. They're not living their lives. They're performing someone else's idea of what a life should be. And the tragedy is, they'll defend this performance to the death. They'll attack anyone who questions it. They'll pathologize anyone who breaks free, because to admit that the identity they've spent decades building and maintaining isn't actually them would require something they're not prepared to do. They'd have to let it die. And that death, that dissolution of the constructed self, is what the ego experiences as the ultimate threat. Because the ego doesn't just fear death. The ego is death. It's the deadening of your authentic nature, the killing of your soul's expression, the suffocation of your true self under layers and layers of conditioning. Meanwhile, beneath this constructed identity, your authentic self is still there. It never left. It can't leave. It's what you actually are beneath all the programming, and it's sending you signals constantly. It speaks through symptoms, the depression that no medication fully touches, because it's not a disease but a message. The anxiety that persists despite every relaxation technique, because it's not a disorder but an alarm. The addiction that you can't quite shake, because it's not weakness but an attempt to self-medicate the pain of not living your actual life. It speaks through dreams, those nightmares where you're trapped, exposed, chased. Those recurring scenarios that your conscious mind dismisses, but which your unconscious keeps presenting because they contain vital information about your true situation. It speaks through existential despair, that 3 a.m. feeling that your life isn't real, that you're somehow performing rather than living, that there's something you're supposed to be doing, but you can't remember what it is. Your authentic self is buried in the unconscious, sending distress signals, trying desperately to get your attention, attempting to break through the false identity that's running your life. And eventually, if you're lucky, or perhaps if you're unlucky, depending on your perspective, something happens that cracks the constructed self wide open. Maybe it's a crisis, the loss of a relationship, a job, a loved one, a diagnosis that forces you to confront your mortality, a betrayal that shatters your worldview, a breakdown that conventional treatment can't fix because it's not actually a breakdown, it's a breakthrough trying to happen. Or maybe it's subtler, a growing sense of meaninglessness, a creeping depression despite external success, a quiet desperation that you can't quite name, a feeling that you're living behind glass, watching your life from a distance, never quite present, never quite real. Whatever the catalyst, something begins to shift. The old self starts to crack, and in those cracks, light gets in. The light of your authentic self waiting beneath the construction, ready to emerge if and only if you're willing to let the false identity die. This is where Michael's story begins, and it's where yours might begin too, if you're ready to see what's actually been happening to you your entire life. Comment, "I'm ready to see," if you're beginning to recognize the constructed nature of your identity, because recognition is the first step toward liberation. Let me tell you about a man named Michael, because his story will show you exactly how the breaking free process actually unfolds in real life. Not in abstract theory, but in the messy, terrifying, ultimately liberating reality of a human psyche demanding its freedom. Michael was 44 years old when everything began to fall apart, or more accurately, when everything began to fall into place, though he couldn't recognize that at the time. On the surface, Michael's life looked exactly like success. He was an emergency room physician at a major hospital, respected by colleagues, relied upon in crisis, known for his calm presence in chaos. He was married to a woman he'd met in medical school, a radiologist with her own successful practice. They had 2 children, a 16-year-old daughter excelling in advanced placement classes, and a 13-year-old son on the competitive soccer team. They lived in a house in a good neighborhood, drove sensible cars, took annual vacations to places that would photograph well. By every conventional measure, Michael had achieved the American dream. But something was wrong. Something had been wrong for a long time, though Michael couldn't name it, couldn't even fully acknowledge it. There was a numbness, a sense of going through motions, of performing a role rather than living a life. He told himself this was normal, that everyone felt this way, that adulthood meant responsibility and sacrifice, and you couldn't expect to feel passionate about your life at 44. The breaking point came on an ordinary Tuesday night shift. Michael was treating an elderly man who'd been brought in with chest pain. Standard procedure, assessment, EKG, blood work, consultation with cardiology. The man was stable but needed admission for observation. As Michael was explaining this to the family, the monitors started alarming. The man was coding. The team rushed in, initiated CPR, pushed medications, shocked the heart. For 18 minutes they fought to bring him back. He didn't make it. Michael delivered the news to the family with appropriate professionalism. He completed the necessary paperwork. He moved to the next patient. And through all of this, he felt nothing. Not sadness, not frustration, not even the grim acceptance that usually accompanies death in the ER. Nothing. Complete emotional numbness. A man had just died. A family was devastated. And Michael felt as if he was watching it happen on a screen rather than participating in it. He finished his shift. He drove home through pre-dawn darkness. He showered, changed, and got into bed next to his sleeping wife. And then he started crying. Not the tears of grief or stress release he was familiar with from difficult shifts. This was something else entirely, a welling up from a depth he didn't know existed, a sobbing that felt like it was coming from his bones, from his very foundation. His wife woke up alarmed. "What's wrong? Did something happen at work?" Michael couldn't answer, because nothing specific had happened. Yet everything had happened. The question, "What's wrong?" felt absurd, because what was wrong was everything, was his entire life, was the fact that he'd just spent 12 hours in an emergency room and hadn't felt anything until the moment it was over. That night, Michael had a dream. Even weeks later, he could recall it with perfect clarity. The way you remember the dreams Jung called archetypal, the ones that come not from personal memory but from something deeper. In the dream, Michael was performing surgery on himself. He was both the surgeon and the patient, somehow watching and experiencing simultaneously. He made an incision across his own chest and opened his rib cage. And when he looked inside, expecting to find heart, lungs, organs, he found nothing. His chest cavity was completely empty, just a hollow space. Except for one thing. In the very center, where his heart should have been, there was a small child curled up, shivering, crying softly. The child looked up at him with his own eyes. Michael's eyes, but younger, maybe 10 or 11 years old. And the child said, "I've been here the whole time. Didn't you hear me calling?" Michael woke up with his pillow soaked with tears. And for the first time in years, maybe for the first time in decades, he felt something. Not numbness, not the controlled professional affect he'd perfected. Real feeling, pain, yes, but also something else. Recognition. The child in his chest wasn't a metaphor. It was him, the actual him that had been locked away, buried alive, trapped beneath the constructed identity of Dr. Michael, while he performed his role on the surface. What happened next looked like a breakdown to everyone around him. Michael couldn't return to the hospital. The thought of putting on scrubs, of stepping back into that role, of maintaining the professional persona, filled him with something close to terror. He called in sick, then filed for emergency leave, citing stress and burnout. His colleagues were concerned but understanding. Emergency medicine was notoriously difficult, and everyone knew someone who'd had to step away. But this wasn't burnout. Michael was experiencing what Jung called the dissolution of the persona, the beginning of the breaking free process. And like most people encountering this for the first time, Michael thought he was losing his mind. The panic attacks started. He'd be sitting in his living room and suddenly his heart would race, his vision would tunnel, and he'd feel convinced he was dying. Except medical tests showed nothing wrong. His body was fine. It was his psyche that was in crisis. Then came the depersonalization, moments where he'd look at his hands and not recognize them as his own. He'd hear his voice and it would sound like a stranger speaking. He'd look in the mirror and see his face but have no sense of connection to it. Is that me? Am I in there? The person in the mirror looked like someone performing the role of Michael. But where was the actual Michael? His wife was frightened. You need to see someone. You need help. And she was right, though not in the way she meant. Michael did need help, but not to restore him to his previous functioning. He needed help to understand that what was happening wasn't pathology, it was awakening. Through a series of synchronicities that Michael couldn't dismiss as mere coincidence, a book appearing on his doorstep that he hadn't ordered, a recommendation from an acquaintance he hadn't spoken to in years, a dream that gave him a specific name, Michael found himself sitting across from a Jungian analyst named Dr. Weiss. Dr. Weiss listened to Michael's story without the pathologizing language Michael had feared. No talk of depression, anxiety disorder, or breakdown. Instead, Dr. Weiss asked, "Michael, who have you been being all these years?" And that question opened everything. Over the following months, through analysis, active imagination work, and dream exploration, Michael began to see the truth. The identity of Dr. Michael, competent, reliable, successful physician, wasn't who he was. It was a role he'd been performing since he was 12 years old. His father had immigrated from India with nothing, worked brutal hours driving a taxi while attending night school, eventually becoming an accountant. His father's dream, his unlived dream, was for his son to become a doctor, to achieve the success and respect that he'd sacrificed everything for, but never quite attained himself. And Michael, unconsciously understanding that his father's love, his father's pride, his father's entire sense that the sacrifice had been worth it, depended on Michael fulfilling this dream, had abandoned his actual self. As a child, Michael had loved music. He'd taught himself piano, composed small pieces, felt transported when he played. He'd written poetry, filling notebooks with observations about the world that moved him to tears and wonder. He'd been fascinated by philosophy, spending hours reading books far above his grade level, thinking about consciousness, meaning, existence. But when he was 12, his father sat him down and said, "Son, I see you wasting time with these hobbies. Piano, poems, these are nice, but they won't give you a life. You're smart. You should be doctor. This is real success. This is why we came to this country." And Michael, in that moment, made a choice that wasn't really a choice. He understood that his father was asking him to carry an unlived life, to redeem a sacrifice, to justify decades of struggle. How could he refuse? How could he say, "Father, I want to play piano and write poetry"? It would have been a betrayal. It would have meant all that suffering was for nothing. So the 12-year-old Michael buried the child who loved music and poetry and philosophy. He constructed a new identity, the serious student who would become a doctor, and he performed that role so well, so completely, that he forgot it was a role. By the time he was 44, he'd been performing it for 32 years. The false self had become total until it cracked. The dream of the empty chest with the crying child wasn't symbolic. It was literal psychological truth. Michael had hollowed himself out to make room for someone else's dream, and the abandoned child, his authentic self, had been there the whole time, crying to be noticed, sending distress signals that Michael had interpreted as stress, burnout, the normal difficulties of adult life. Dr. Weiss introduced Michael to Jung's concept of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you actually are rather than who you were conditioned to be. And he warned Michael that this process would be painful, disorienting, and would likely cost him things he thought he couldn't live without. He was right. As Michael stopped performing the Dr. Michael role, his relationships began to crumble. His wife didn't recognize him anymore. "Where is my husband? I married a doctor, a responsible man. Now you're talking about music and poetry like a teenager. We have children, a mortgage, responsibilities." His father was devastated. When Michael finally admitted he was taking a leave of absence from medicine to explore other paths, his father said, "Everything I sacrificed, it was for you to throw it away?" The pain in his voice was real, and Michael felt the full weight of generations of unlived lives trying to continue through him. His colleagues were confused. "You're too good at this to quit. This is just burnout. Take a vacation, come back refreshed." But Michael knew he couldn't come back. Not to that role, not to that life, because it wasn't his life. It never had been. What emerged over the next 2 years was something Michael couldn't have imagined. As the old self shattered, as Dr. Michael died, something else began to surface. The man who'd been buried at age 12 started to come back to life. Michael bought a piano, started playing again, and felt for the first time in decades the feeling he remembered from childhood, the sense of being completely present, completely himself, completely alive. He began writing again, not with any intention of publication or career, but simply because words poured out of him, needed to be expressed, wanted to exist. He found work as a medical consultant, something that used his knowledge without requiring him to perform the physician persona. It paid enough. It was fine, but it wasn't his identity. His marriage ended. His wife couldn't make the journey with him. She'd married Dr. Michael, and when he ceased to exist, so did the foundation of their relationship. The divorce was painful, but ultimately honest. They'd been playing roles with each other, not relating authentically. His relationship with his father remained difficult, though over time something shifted. As Michael became more himself, as his father saw him genuinely happy for the first time in years, a different kind of respect emerged. Not the pride of vicarious achievement, but something deeper, the recognition of his son's courage to live his own life, even at great cost. But that's getting ahead of the story. The crucial point is this: Michael's journey through the 12 shifts became his roadmap from the false self to the authentic self. And each shift, while disorienting and often painful, was a marker that the breaking free process was proceeding exactly as it needed to. You need to understand, Michael's story isn't exceptional, it's archetypal. The details differ person to person, but the pattern is the same. Everyone who individuates goes through some version of what Michael experienced. The old self shatters, the authentic self emerges. The process is terrifying, and it's the only way to actually live your life instead of performing someone else's script. So ask yourself, are you living your life or performing someone else's unlived dreams? Comment, "I see Michael in myself," if his story resonates with your own experience. Because if it does, what I'm about to share next might be the most important information you'll ever encounter. Now that you've seen the breaking free process in action through Michael's story, we need to understand exactly what's breaking, because you can't liberate yourself from something you don't comprehend, and most people have no idea what their old self actually consists of. Carl Jung spent decades mapping the architecture of the false identity, and what he discovered is both fascinating and disturbing. The you think you are is actually a composite structure assembled from multiple layers of conditioning, each serving a different function, each contributing to the prison of the constructed self. Let me show you the complete anatomy of what Jung called the old self, the false identity that must break free for your authentic self to emerge. Jung used the Latin word persona, which originally meant mask. Specifically, the masks worn by actors in ancient theater to indicate which character they were playing. And that's exactly what your persona is, a set of social masks designed for survival and acceptance. You don't have just one persona, you have many. There's the professional you at work, the family you at home, the social you with friends, the public you in formal situations, the private you with intimate partners. These are all slightly different performances, each calibrated for maximum acceptance and minimum threat in a specific social context. The persona isn't inherently problematic. Jung emphasized that we need personas to function in society. They're like clothing, necessary for particular situations, protective in certain environments. The problem comes when you forget you're wearing a mask, when you identify so completely with the persona that you think it's your actual face. Michael's doctor persona, calm, competent, unflappable, worked perfectly in the emergency room. But when he couldn't take it off, when that mask became his identity, he lost contact with everything beneath it. Deeper than the persona lies what Jung called ego identifications, the labels and roles you've attached your sense of self to. These are the I am statements that define your identity. I am a mother. I am an engineer. I am a Christian. I am a Democrat. I am a survivor. I am someone who values honesty. I am an introvert. Each of these seems like a simple fact about yourself, but Jung recognized them as attachments, places where your ego has become identified with a particular role, belief, or characteristic. And when you're identified, you can't see clearly. You defend these identifications as if they're your actual self, when they're just more layers of construction. When someone challenges your political identity, you feel personally attacked, not because they're threatening your actual self, but because your ego has identified with that political position. When someone questions your parenting, you feel defensive, not because they're threatening your children, but because your ego has identified as a good mother. These identifications are invisible bars in the prison. They constrain what you can think, feel, and do while maintaining the identity. A good Christian can't acknowledge certain thoughts or desires. A rational person can't admit to mystical experiences. A strong person can't show vulnerability. The identification limits your humanity to maintain the identity. Even more deeply embedded are what Jung called parental introjects, the internalized voices of authority figures dictating who you should be. This isn't about what your parents explicitly taught you. It's about the unconscious programming that occurred before you had the capacity to question or resist it. You internalized your father's expectations, your mother's fears, your parents' unlived dreams, their compensations for their own wounds. These voices now operate as autonomous structures in your psyche, constantly evaluating your thoughts and behaviors, generating guilt when you deviate, creating anxiety when you approach territory your parents found threatening. Michael carried his father's voice. Success means being a doctor. Anything less is failure and betrayal. This wasn't what his father explicitly said every day. It was the unconscious message, absorbed from thousands of interactions, crystallized into an internal authority that Michael experienced as his own values. Many people discover during the breaking free process that the critical voice they thought was their conscience is actually their mother's anxiety or their father's rage. internalized so completely that they can't distinguish it from their own thinking. Beyond the family lies the broader culture, the collective programming about success, relationships, gender, spirituality, what makes a life worth living. This is perhaps the most invisible layer because everyone around you shares the same conditioning, making it feel like objective reality rather than cultural construction. Your culture taught you what success looks like, what a real man or woman is, what love should feel like, what family structure is normal, what ambitions are worthy, what spirituality means, what age you should achieve certain milestones, how much money you should have, what body you should present. These aren't universal truths. They're culturally specific programming, but because you've been marinating in them since birth, they feel like truth. Jung emphasized that individuating requires recognizing and questioning this collective conditioning, seeing it as one possibility among many rather than as reality itself. Now we reach a layer that's especially difficult to recognize as false self, because trauma responses feel so authentically yours. They emerged from your unique experience and seem like fundamental aspects of your personality. When something overwhelms your capacity to process it, abuse, neglect, violence, loss, betrayal, you don't just store the memory. You create an adaptive strategy to prevent that kind of harm from happening again. You become the vigilant one who can't relax, because relaxation means vulnerability. The people pleaser who can't say no, because no meant punishment. The achiever who can't stop, because stopping means worthlessness. The cynic who can't trust because trust meant betrayal. The invisible one who can't be seen because visibility meant danger. These adaptations kept you safe. They worked, but then they hardened into identity. The protective strategy became who you think you are, and decades after the original threat has passed, you're still maintaining a defensive posture that no longer serves you. Jung observed that many people live their entire lives operating from trauma responses they've mistaken for personality. The woman who is just independent is actually protecting herself from the dependency that led to abandonment. The man who doesn't need anyone is actually armored against the vulnerability that led to humiliation. Breaking free requires recognizing that these aren't your authentic nature. They're adaptive strategies you develop to survive. And while they deserve respect and gratitude for keeping you alive, they must be dismantled for you to actually live. Sixth layer, shadow projections. Jung's most famous concept is the shadow, the repository of everything you've rejected, denied, or refused to see in yourself. But the shadow doesn't just sit there passively. It projects outward, creating your experience of others and the world. You hate in others what you refuse to see in yourself. You're attracted to in others what you've disowned in yourself. You're threatened by in others what you're suppressing in yourself. The world becomes a mirror reflecting back the parts of yourself you won't acknowledge. The old self maintains its good image through shadow projection. I'm kind, they're selfish. I'm rational, they're emotional. I'm spiritual, they're materialistic. The splitting creates a false sense of identity. You know who you are by knowing who you're not. Breaking free requires withdrawing these projections, recognizing that what you see in others exists in yourself. This is devastating to the old self because the entire identity structure was built on splitting, on being this and not that. Seventh layer, unconscious complexes. The deepest layer Jung identified were complexes, autonomous psychological structures that hijack consciousness. These are like sub-personalities, each with its own history, emotional charge, and agenda. You might have a mother complex that gets activated in certain situations, suddenly making you feel and act like a child seeking approval. An authority complex that turns you rebellious or compliant when confronted by power. A romantic complex that makes you lose your rational faculties around certain types of people. Jung discovered that these complexes aren't under conscious control. They possess you temporarily, taking over consciousness and acting through you. You feel their emotional intensity, act out their patterns, and only afterward realize that wasn't really me, except it was you, a dissociated part of your psyche that remains unconscious until the breaking free process brings it into awareness. Michael had what Jungians would call a savior complex, an unconscious structure that compelled him to rescue, fix, and be indispensable. This complex drove his choice of emergency medicine, his role in his family, his inability to have needs of his own. It felt like compassion, like dedication, like his authentic nature. But it was actually an autonomous structure running his life while he watched, believing he was making conscious choices. Now, here's what makes this entire structure so insidious. Each layer reinforces the others. The persona performs the ego identifications. The ego identifications express the parental introjects. The parental introjects align with cultural conditioning. The cultural conditioning validates the trauma responses. The trauma responses generate shadow projections. The shadow projections activate unconscious complexes, and the complexes strengthen the persona. It's a self-maintaining system, a prison that rebuilds itself automatically whenever you try to escape, which is exactly why breaking free feels so impossible, why most people never even attempt it, why those who do often fail and return to the comfortable confinement of the false self. Jung emphasized something crucial here. The old self isn't inherently bad or wrong. These structures serve necessary survival and development functions. The persona helped you navigate social situations you couldn't handle authentically. The ego identifications gave you a stable sense of self during development. The parental introjects provided internal guidance when you were too young to generate your own. The cultural conditioning connected you to the collective. The trauma responses protected you from overwhelming experiences. The shadow projections kept intolerable material out of consciousness. The complexes compartmentalized experiences you couldn't integrate. All of this was necessary. All of it worked. The problem comes when you remain identified with these structures beyond their usefulness, when the scaffolding that helped build the house becomes mistaken for the house itself. Jung used this exact metaphor. The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. The old self was a shoe that fit you at one point in your development. But you've grown, and now that shoe pinches. It restricts. It deforms. But you've worn it so long it feels like part of your foot. Breaking free doesn't mean destroying the ego, demolishing the persona, or eliminating these structures entirely. That would be psychosis, a complete fragmentation of consciousness. What it means is the ego surrendering its tyrannical control, recognizing that it's not the center of consciousness, but a servant of something deeper, what Jung called the self with a capital S. The old self must die as your identity, so the authentic self can live through you. The structures remain, but you stop being identified with them. You can still wear personas when appropriate, but you know they're masks. You can still hold ego identifications, but loosely, knowing they're partial and provisional. You can hear parental voices, but recognize them as internalized others rather than your own truth. You can function within cultural norms without mistaking them for universal reality. You can utilize protective strategies without becoming them. You can integrate shadow material without being possessed by it. You can have complexes without them having you. This is what Jung meant by individuation, not the perfection of the personality, not the achievement of some idealized state, but the disidentification from the constructed self and the alignment with your authentic nature. And the question you must ask yourself right now is, how much of what you call myself is actually you? And how much is this constructed composite of conditioning, trauma, and unconscious structures? Because you can't answer that question from inside the prison. The old self can't see itself. It's looking through its own eyes, interpreting everything through its own filters. You need the perspective shift that comes from the breaking free process itself. That's what the 12 shifts provide. Mile markers on the journey out of imprisonment. Signs that the old self is losing its grip. Evidence that your authentic self is emerging whether the ego likes it or not. Let me ask you directly, can you feel the weight of these layers? Can you sense how much of what you call you might actually be programming? Comment below which layer feels heaviest right now, which part of the old self you're beginning to recognize as false. Because recognition is the beginning of liberation. And the first shift is about to show you just how radical that liberation becomes. The first shift you'll experience when the old self begins to break free is both subtle and completely disorienting. It happens gradually at first, then all at once, like ice melting from solid to liquid. And it feels exactly like what the ego fears most, like you're losing yourself. Where you once knew exactly who you were, with absolute certainty about your preferences, beliefs, values, and nature, you suddenly find yourself in a state of profound uncertainty. The labels you've used for decades, the descriptors that felt like bedrock reality, suddenly seem like costumes you're wearing rather than truth about who you are. You look in the mirror and think, is that me? Am I in there? The face is familiar but somehow distant, like you're looking at a photograph of someone you used to know well but have lost touch with. Someone asks you what kind of music you like and you genuinely can't answer, not because you don't want to, but because you suddenly realize you have no idea. Did you actually like that music, or was it just what you thought someone like you should like? You're at a social gathering performing your usual persona, and suddenly you're watching yourself from the outside. You can hear your own voice saying the things you always say, making the jokes you always make, presenting the personality you always present, and you feel like an actor playing a role, reading lines you've memorized but no longer recognize as yours. Carl Jung called this the dissolution phase, and he emphasized that while it feels like disintegration, it's actually the first stage of transformation. The fixed identity, the solid, seemingly unchangeable self, must liquefy before it can be reformed into something authentic. Think of it like this. You can't reshape ice while it's frozen. The structure is too rigid, too defended, too crystallized in its current form. Heat must be applied, energy must be introduced, and the solid state must dissolve into liquid before any genuine transformation becomes possible. This is what's happening to your identity. For Michael, this shift began that night. He couldn't feel anything as his patient died. The numbness was actually the beginning of dissolution. His doctor persona, which had been solid and reliable for 3 decades, suddenly becoming permeable. In the days and weeks that followed, he experienced the full force of identity fluidity. He'd be driving to the hospital and couldn't remember why he was going there. Not in a medical emergency sense. He knew there was work to do, but he couldn't connect to the identity of Dr. Michael Rodriguez, emergency physician. The name felt like someone else's. The role felt like something he'd agreed to perform but no longer understood why. His wife would reference their history. Remember when we decided we wanted 2 children? Remember when you said you loved emergency medicine because of the adrenaline? And Michael would have no memory of those decisions feeling authentic. They felt like things that happened to someone else, or things he'd said because they were the right things to say, not because they represented his actual desires. He forgot his own preferences. Did he like coffee or tea? What was his favorite food? What kind of movies did he enjoy? These weren't questions he'd ever consciously considered. They were just facts about himself. Except now, confronted with them directly, he realized he had no idea. Everything felt like performance, like adopted preferences designed to complete the character of Dr. Michael. This is terrifying when it's happening to you. Your friends and family are still treating you like the solid, consistent person you've always been. But internally, you're experiencing radical uncertainty about everything you thought you knew about yourself. The ego interprets this as pathology. I'm having an identity crisis. I'm dissociating. I'm losing my mind. The medical establishment, trained to pathologize anything outside normal functioning, has diagnostic categories ready: depersonalization, derealization disorder, dissociative identity, disruption, major depressive disorder, with decreased sense of self. But Jung recognized this dissolution as breakthrough, not breakdown. He understood that the fixed identity wasn't truth, it was construction, and that construction must dissolve before authentic identity can emerge. This is where most people regress. The disorientation becomes unbearable, and they desperately try to re-solidify their old identity. They throw themselves back into their role with renewed intensity, trying to convince themselves and others that they're fine, that they're still the person they've always been. They seek medication to restore normal functioning, not realizing that normal functioning meant maintenance of the false self. The people around you will often encourage this regression because your dissolution threatens their own constructed identities. If you can question who you are, they might have to question who they are. Your uncertainty makes them uncertain, so they'll try to remind you, "You're a Dr. Michael. This is who you've always been. You're just tired, stressed. You need rest, not existential crisis." But if you can stay with the dissolution, if you can tolerate the uncertainty without rushing to re-solidify into a fixed identity, something remarkable begins to happen. You start to experience moments of what Jung called free-floating consciousness, awareness that isn't attached to any particular identity. You're not a doctor or a parent or a spiritual person or an introvert. You're simply aware, present, conscious, without the constant internal narrative about who you are and what that means. And in those moments, you might experience something you haven't felt since childhood: genuine spontaneity, a response that isn't calculated, calibrated, or performed, a laugh that's real, a tear that's authentic, a thought that's actually yours, not a processed version of what you think you should think. This is what Michael experienced during his first piano session after 32 years. He sat down expecting nothing. The instrument was just something he'd ordered on a strange impulse he couldn't explain. He put his hands on the keys without agenda, without goal, without identity, and something moved through him. Not Dr. Michael playing piano, or even Michael who used to love music, just music happening, expression occurring, life moving through his hands without mediation by the constructed self. Afterward, he couldn't even describe what he'd played. It wasn't performance, wasn't achievement, wasn't anything that could be labeled or categorized. It was just aliveness, the first moment of genuine aliveness he'd experienced in decades. This is what becomes possible when identity dissolves. Directed experience, unmediated by the ego's constant interpretation and categorization. But here's what you need to understand. This shift isn't a one-time event. The dissolution happens in waves. You'll have periods of profound uncertainty followed by temporary re-solidification. The old identity will try to reform, and you'll find yourself slipping back into familiar patterns, performing the old roles. This is normal and necessary. Jung emphasized that transformation doesn't happen linearly. It's more like a spiral. You return to the same places, but at a different level each time. Each dissolution cycle goes deeper, liquefying more of the constructed identity, creating more space for the authentic self to emerge. The key is learning to distinguish between two types of dissociation. Pathological dissociation is escape from overwhelming experience. It's a traumatic fragmentation where consciousness splits to protect itself from what it cannot process. This type of dissociation feels numb, absent, shut down. There's a quality of running away from reality, of needing to not be present, because presence is intolerable. Healthy ego dissolution is release from the prison of fixed identity. It feels fluid, uncertain, open. There's a quality of expanding into something larger, of discovering that you're not as small or fixed as you thought. Even when it's uncomfortable, there's an aliveness to it, a sense of something authentic trying to emerge. How do you tell the difference? Pathological dissociation wants to avoid. Healthy dissolution wants to discover. Pathological dissociation feels dead. Healthy dissolution feels uncertain but alive. Pathological dissociation leaves you less functional. Healthy dissolution might temporarily disrupt your functioning, but ultimately increases your capacity. Pathological dissociation comes from trauma that hasn't been processed. Healthy dissolution comes from consciousness that's ready to expand beyond its current limitations. Michael learned to work with this distinction. When he felt numb, absent, unable to feel anything, that was pathological dissociation, a trauma response that needed therapeutic attention. But when he felt uncertain about who he was, when his old identity seemed like a costume he was wearing, that was healthy dissolution, the breaking free process unfolding exactly as it needed to. Dr. Weiss taught him a practice Jung called active imagination, a way to dialogue with the dissolution rather than fighting it. When Michael felt his identity becoming fluid, instead of panicking and trying to re-solidify, he would ask, "What wants to emerge? What's beneath this constructed identity? Who am I when I'm not performing Dr. Michael?" And in the space created by those questions, hints began to appear, not a new fixed identity to replace the old one. Jung warned against that trap, but glimpses of something more fundamental, a sense of self that didn't depend on roles or labels, a consciousness that existed prior to and beyond all the constructed identities. This is what Jung meant when he wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not to become a better version of your false self, not to optimize your persona, but to discover the one who exists beneath all the construction, the authentic nature that was there before you were conditioned, that remains present beneath all the programming, that will be there when all the false identities finally dissolve completely." So let me ask you, have you experienced this identity dissolution? Have there been moments when you looked at your life and couldn't recognize it as yours? When your own preferences seemed like someone else's? When the person you've always been suddenly felt like a character you've been playing? If you're experiencing this shift right now, comment "I'm breaking free" below, because you're not going crazy, you're not falling apart, you're not losing yourself, you're losing the false self. And that loss, as terrifying as it feels, is the first necessary step toward finding who you actually are. The dissolution has begun, and there's no going back, not really. Once you've seen that your identity is constructed, you can't fully believe in its solidity again. The ice has started to melt, and everything that follows depends on your willingness to remain liquid, to resist the temptation to refreeze into a new fixed identity, and to trust that something authentic is waiting to emerge from the dissolution. Are you ready for what comes next? Because if the first shift is about identity becoming fluid, the second shift is about discovering what that fluidity reveals about all your relationships. If the first shift shows you that your identity is constructed, the second shift reveals something even more devastating. Your relationships are too. This is the shift that often causes the most immediate, visible damage to your life. Because as the old self breaks free, as your identity begins to dissolve, something else starts happening simultaneously. You begin to see other people clearly for the first time in your life. And what you see is shocking. The people you thought you knew, the relationships you thought were real, the connections you thought were deep, you suddenly recognize them as elaborate mutual agreements to maintain illusions. You were playing a role, they were playing a role, and the entire relationship was an unconscious script you were both performing. Carl Jung understood this with painful clarity. He wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But here's what most people miss about that quote. Before transformation can happen, the projections must be withdrawn. And when projections are withdrawn, most relationships don't transform, they collapse. Let me explain what projection is, because this is absolutely central to understanding why your relationships become intolerable as the old self breaks free. Projection is the unconscious process of seeing in others what actually exists in yourself. But it's more than that. It's also the process of needing others to play specific roles so you can maintain your identity. Your psyche projects onto other people not just disowned parts of yourself, but also complementary roles that sustain your false self. You need someone to be weak so you can be strong. You need someone to be irresponsible so you can be the responsible one. You need someone to be emotional so you can be rational. You need someone to fail so you can succeed. You need someone to need you so you can be needed. The old self doesn't exist in isolation. It exists in relationship, defined by its difference from and interaction with others. And as the old self begins to dissolve, these projections start to withdraw. You stop unconsciously assigning roles to people. You stop needing them to be what you need them to be so you can be what you need to be. And suddenly you see them. Actually see them. Not your projection of them, not your fantasy of them, not your need for them to be a certain way. You see the actual person, independent of your psyche's requirements. For most people, this is when relationships begin to crack. Michael's experience with his wife demonstrates this perfectly. He thought he'd married someone he loved. But as his Dr. Michael identity dissolved, as he stopped needing to be the strong, capable, providing physician, he withdrew the complementary projection he'd placed on his wife. He'd needed her to be the stable one, the grounded one, the person who appreciated his sacrifice and dedication. That's not who she actually was. It was a role he'd unconsciously assigned her, and she'd unconsciously accepted. Their entire marriage was built on this mutual projection. He was the heroic doctor. She was the admiring partner who gave his sacrifice meaning. When Michael stopped being the heroic doctor, his wife didn't know how to relate to him anymore. "Where is my husband?" she asked, but what she really meant was, "Where is the person playing the role I need them to play so I can maintain my own identity?" She'd married Dr. Michael because her own identity was built on being the wife of a successful physician. That wasn't conscious manipulation, it was unconscious need. Her sense of self, her place in the world, her role in her family and social circle, all of it depended on Michael maintaining his persona. When he began breaking free, her own false self felt threatened. If he could question his identity, she might have to question hers. If his constructed self could dissolve, hers might dissolve too. The terror of that possibility manifested as anger, confusion, and eventually the ultimatum: become who you were or this relationship ends. This pattern repeats across every type of relationship as the old self breaks free. Friendships that felt deep suddenly reveal themselves as bonding through shared complaints. You and your friend maintained connection by agreeing that your jobs sucked, your families were difficult, the world was going to hell. But when you stop complaining, when you start taking responsibility for your experience, when you begin changing your relationship to difficulty, suddenly there's nothing to talk about. The friendship wasn't based on genuine connection. It was based on mutual reinforcement of victimhood. Family dynamics explode because you're no longer playing your assigned role. Every family is an unconscious system of roles designed to maintain equilibrium. The responsible one, the scapegoat, the golden child, the mediator, the rebel, the caretaker. These roles are assigned unconsciously, often in early childhood, and the family system depends on everyone maintaining their role for the system to function. When you stop playing your role, when the old self that accepted that role begins to break free, the entire family system destabilizes. You're not being the responsible one anymore. Now who's going to manage everything? You're not being the scapegoat anymore. Now who are we going to blame for our dysfunction? You're not being the caretaker anymore. Now who's going to manage everyone's emotions? The family doesn't experience this as your liberation. They experience it as your betrayal. You're breaking the unconscious contract. You're threatening the system's stability, and systems protect themselves, often by increasing pressure on the deviating member to return to their role. Michael experienced this with his extended family. His role had been the successful one. The immigrant family's proof that their sacrifice paid off, their evidence that the American dream worked, their validation that leaving everything behind had meaning. When Michael left medicine, when he admitted he was unhappy and needed to find his own path, it wasn't just his individual choice. It was a threat to the entire family narrative. His mother said, "What will I tell my friends?" His siblings expressed concern that really masked judgment. His cousins stopped inviting him to family gatherings where professional success was performed and compared. He wasn't fitting his role anymore, and an unconscious conspiracy emerged to pressure him back into it. Romantic relationships are perhaps most vulnerable to this shift because they're often most densely packed with projections. Jung wrote extensively about what he called the anima and animus, the unconscious feminine in men and the unconscious masculine in women. These are archetypal images that we project onto romantic partners, seeing in them qualities we've disowned or failed to develop in ourselves. A man who's disconnected from his emotional, intuitive, receptive nature projects that onto a woman and falls in love with his projection. He thinks he loves her, but he actually loves the disowned parts of himself that he sees in her. A woman who's disconnected from her assertive, independent, decisive nature projects that onto a man and falls in love with her projection. She thinks she needs him, but she actually needs to reclaim what she's projected onto him. As the old self breaks free, these projections start to withdraw. You begin to develop in yourself what you'd been seeking in your partner. The man starts to access his own emotional depth, his own intuition, his own receptivity. The woman starts to access her own assertiveness, her own independence, her own decisiveness. And the relationship, which was unconsciously designed to keep both partners incomplete, each providing what the other lacked, suddenly loses its function. If you're becoming whole yourself, why do you need this specific person to complete you? Sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, both partners individuate together. They support each other's breaking free process. They're willing to release the projections and relate authentically. They're capable of loving the actual person rather than the fantasy. These relationships deepen and transform, but more often, one partner individuates while the other clings to the old self. One person is breaking free while the other is desperately trying to maintain the constructed identity, and the relationship becomes a battlefield between consciousness and unconsciousness, between authenticity and performance, between growth and stagnation. This is excruciating when you're experiencing it. You can see that your partner is unconscious, is performing rather than being, is identified with a false self. But they can't see it, and they experience your seeing, your breaking free, your refusal to play the old game as attack abandonment, or betrayal. Michael's divorce wasn't because either he or his wife was wrong or bad. It was because their relationship had been built on a mutual projection that could only exist as long as both maintained their false selves. When Michael's false self began to dissolve, the foundation of the relationship dissolved with it. Jung emphasized that this is necessary and healthy. He said relationships built on the false self cannot survive awakening. They weren't real relationships. They were unconscious agreements to maintain each other's illusions. And while that served a purpose during a certain phase of development, it becomes an obstacle to actual growth. But here's where it gets subtle and important. Not every relationship that becomes uncomfortable during the breaking free process needs to end. The challenge is distinguishing between relationships that can't transform and relationships that are transforming. Relationships that can't transform depend on you staying unconscious, feel threatened by your growth, actively work to pull you back to your old self, are built entirely on projections with no authentic connection, punish honesty, authenticity, or change, require you to perform a role for the other person's identity to remain intact. Relationships that are transforming are uncomfortable because they're stretching to accommodate your changes, show moments of genuine recognition and connection, even amid the difficulty, have people willing to look at their own projections were built on some foundation of authentic relating beneath the projections support growth. Even when it's inconvenient or frightening, allow both people to evolve. The difficulty is that during the breaking free process, you often can't tell which is which. Everything feels intolerable because your capacity for unconscious relating has been disrupted. You can't perform the old roles anymore, even if you wanted to. Jung advised patients here, don't hastily destroy all your relationships in a frenzy of authenticity seeking, but also don't sacrifice your individuation to preserve relationships that can only exist if you remain unconscious. It's a delicate balance, and it requires you to stay present with tremendous discomfort. Michael lost his marriage. That was real loss, real grief, real consequence. But he also discovered which friendships could survive the transformation and which were only bonding through shared illusions. His relationship with his father remained difficult, but began to contain moments of genuine respect rather than just role-playing. His relationship with his children deepened as he stopped being the successful doctor father and became more human, more vulnerable, more present. Some relationships ended, some transformed, and the space created by the endings allowed for new connections, people drawn not to his persona, but to his authenticity, not to his role, but to his actual presence. Here's what you need to understand. As the old self breaks free, you're not just changing your identity, you're changing your entire relational field. Every connection you have was calibrated to the false self. And as that false self dissolves, the connections recalibrate or collapse. This is why the breaking free process is so socially costly. You're not just losing a sense of identity, you're potentially losing your entire social world. Friends, family, partners, colleagues, everyone who is relating to the old self now has to decide whether they can relate to the emerging, authentic self. Many can't. Many won't. Many will experience your transformation as abandonment or betrayal, never recognizing that you're not abandoning them. You're abandoning a false identity that they mistook for you. Jung created a framework he called the projection withdrawal inventory to help people navigate this shift. It's a practice of examining each significant relationship and asking, what role do I need this person to play for my identity to remain intact? What role does this person need me to play for their identity to remain intact? Who is this person independent of my projections? Can I love the actual person, Or do I only love my projection? Can this person love the actual me, or do they only love their projection of who I should be? Is there authentic connection beneath the roles, or is it entirely constructed? These are not comfortable questions, and the answers are often not comfortable either, but they're essential questions if you're going to navigate the second shift without destroying relationships that could transform while maintaining relationships that can only survive if you stay false. Let me ask you directly. Look at your significant relationships right now. Which ones require you to play a specific role? Which ones feel threatened when you change? Which ones are based on mutual projections rather than genuine seeing? Which ones support your breaking free process, even when it's uncomfortable for them? Comment, I see the projections, if you're beginning to recognize how much of your relational life has been unconscious role-playing rather than authentic connection, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And the relationships that can't adapt to your seeing will begin to fall away, creating space for something more real, more honest, more aligned with your authentic self. The old self-maintained relationships through projection and performance. The emerging self seeks relationship through authentic presence. And that transition from one way of relating to another is one of the most painful and necessary aspects of the breaking free process. But it leads somewhere. It leads to the third shift, where you encounter the parts of yourself you've spent a lifetime denying. And that encounter changes everything. If the first two shifts destabilize your identity and relationships, the third shift confronts you with something even more disturbing. You're not who you thought you were. You're not as good, as moral, as enlightened, or as evolved as you've been telling yourself. In fact, you contain within you everything you've spent your life denying, judging, and projecting onto others. Carl Jung called this the shadow, and encountering it is perhaps the most crucial and most terrifying aspect of the breaking free process. The shadow isn't just your bad qualities or your dark side, though that's how it's often misunderstood. The shadow is everything you've had to disown, repress, and split off from consciousness in order to maintain your acceptable self-image. It contains everything your family, culture, and conditioning told you was unacceptable to be. And here's the shocking truth Jung discovered. The shadow doesn't just contain negative qualities, it contains tremendous vitality, creativity, strength, and aliveness. Some of the most valuable parts of your authentic self are buried in the shadow because they were too powerful, too intense, too threatening to the constructed identity. A child who was told good girls don't get angry doesn't just repress her anger, she splits it off entirely, creates an unconscious repository where it lives in exile, and constructs a false self that's never angry. 30 years later, she's a woman who doesn't really do anger, who stays calm in difficult situations, who doesn't understand why people get so worked up about things. But the anger didn't disappear. It's in the shadow, operating unconsciously, leaking out in passive aggression, in depression, which is often anger turned inward, in mysterious illnesses, in dreams of violence, in projections onto others. Why is everyone so angry? Why is the world so hostile? As the old self breaks free, as the rigid defenses that kept the shadow unconscious begin to dissolve, all that disowned material starts to surface. And this is where many people's breaking free process aborts, because encountering your shadow feels like becoming a terrible person rather than becoming a whole person. Michael's shadow encounter began about 4 months into his breaking free process. He'd successfully left the hospital, was starting to explore music again, was feeling some relief from no longer performing the Dr. Michael persona. He thought he was making good progress. Then the dreams started. In one dream, he was in the hospital, but instead of saving patients, he was killing them, methodically, coldly, with complete indifference. He woke up horrified, convinced something was deeply wrong with him. How could he dream such things? What kind of monster was lurking inside him? Dr. Weiss helped him understand. The dream wasn't revealing that Michael was a murderer. It was revealing his shadow, the rage he'd never been allowed to express, the resentment he'd spent decades repressing, the death wish he'd harbored towards the physician identity that had imprisoned him. "You weren't killing patients in the dream," Dr. Weiss explained. "You were killing the role you've been forced to play. The healer persona has been suffocating your authentic self. The shadow is showing you the rage about that suffocation." But Michael's shadow contained more than rage. As he continued the work of active imagination, dialoguing with the dream figures, allowing disowned parts to speak, more material emerged. He discovered his envy. He'd spent years cultivating an image as someone who was happy for others' success, who celebrated his colleagues, who was free from petty jealousy. But beneath that cultivated image was profound envy of people who'd followed their passion, of friends who'd never sacrificed themselves, of artists and musicians who'd lived authentically while he'd been performing a role. The envy was so intense, so toxic, that he'd had to bury it completely. But buried doesn't mean gone. It means unconscious and therefore more powerful. He discovered his selfishness. The Dr. Michael persona was built on selflessness, on service, on putting others first. But his shadow contained raw, unapologetic selfishness, the part of him that didn't want to help anyone, that resented every person who needed him, that wanted to say "fuck you" to every patient, every family member, every person who'd ever taken his dedication for granted. He discovered his cruelty. The constructed Michael was kind, patient, understanding, but his shadow contained a sadistic edge, the part that had secretly enjoyed watching arrogant people fail, that felt satisfaction when the strong became weak, that harbored revenge fantasies against everyone who'd wounded him. He discovered his sexuality, not his civilized, appropriate married man's sexuality, but the raw, undifferentiated, amoral sexual energy that doesn't care about relationship or commitment or appropriateness. The shadow contained desires that horrified him, fantasies he'd never admitted to anyone, impulses he'd successfully repressed through exhaustion and distraction. This is where most people panic and try to shove everything back into the unconscious. "I'm not those things. That's not me. Those are bad thoughts, toxic impulses, evidence of moral failure." And they double down on the false self, recommit to being good, kind, selfless, appropriate, anything to avoid acknowledging the shadow. But Jung was emphatic. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The shadow must be integrated, not repressed, because what you don't integrate, you act out. What you don't acknowledge consciously, you express unconsciously. The nice person who's never angry becomes passive-aggressive, manipulative, martyred. The rational person who's repressed their irrational mystical side becomes dogmatic, rigid, contemptuous of anything that doesn't fit their worldview. The responsible person who's buried their reckless impulses has an affair, makes an impulsive, destructive decision, or self-sabotages in ways they can't explain. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly. The most righteous people harboring the most toxic shadow material. The most spiritual people possessing the most denied material desires. The most moral people concealing the most amoral impulses. It's not that they're hypocrites, it's that consciousness requires splitting. To be this, you must deny that. To maintain the image of saint, you must exile the sinner. But the exiled material doesn't disappear. It accumulates power in the unconscious. Michael's encounter with his shadow was devastating to his self-image. He thought he'd been a good person, a dedicated physician, a selfless servant, but now he had to acknowledge he'd also been resentful, envious, rageful, selfish, and cruel, just unconsciously. He'd been acting out these qualities in subtle, deniable ways his entire life, while maintaining the conscious image of someone who didn't have those qualities. His selflessness had been manipulation. If I give everything, I can control outcomes and maintain my identity as indispensable. His service had been self-aggrandizement. I'm the hero, the savior, the one who can handle what others can't. His dedication had been avoidance, working obsessively to escape his own inner life, his own needs, his own unlived self. Seeing this clearly, without the ego's defensive justifications and rationalizations, was excruciating. It would have been easier to retreat, to decide he was a terrible person, to fall into shame and self-punishment. But Jung taught something different. The shadow isn't proof of your moral failure. It's evidence of your wholeness trying to emerge. Every quality you've denied exists in you because you're a complete human being. You contain light and darkness, kindness and cruelty, generosity and selfishness, wisdom and foolishness, strength and weakness. The old self maintained its acceptable image by splitting, identifying with good qualities and projecting bad qualities onto others. The authentic self embraces the totality. Jung wrote, "I'd rather be whole than good." This is perhaps the most radical statement in his entire body of work, because it directly contradicts what religion, culture, and the superego have been telling you your entire life, that you should aspire to be good, to be moral, to be light. But aspiring to be only good means remaining split. It means maintaining the false self that identifies with acceptable qualities, while the shadow grows more powerful in the unconscious. Jung observed that the most dangerous people are those convinced of their own goodness because they have no relationship to their shadow and therefore act it out unconsciously, often causing tremendous harm while believing they're doing good. The alternative is integration, not acting out your shadow impulses. That's not integration, that's possession. Integration means bringing the disowned material into consciousness, acknowledging it, understanding it, and incorporating its energy without being identified with it or possessed by it. Michael learned to do this through a practice Dr. Weiss introduced, called shadow dialogue. Instead of judging his shadow qualities or trying to eliminate them, he learned to dialogue with them, to understand what they wanted, what function they served, what valid needs they represented. His envy wasn't just toxic emotion, it contained information. It was showing him what he actually valued, what he'd sacrificed, what he genuinely wanted. When he stopped judging the envy and started listening to it, it revealed, "You've been living someone else's life. These people you envy are living their own lives. That's what you want. That's what I'm pointing toward." His selfishness wasn't just moral failure. It contained healthy self-preservation. It was the part of him that knew he couldn't give endlessly without destroying himself, that understood boundaries are necessary, that recognized he had needs and desires that deserved attention. When he stopped condemning the selfishness and started honoring it, he learned to say no, to prioritize his well-being, to recognize that self-care isn't self-indulgence. His rage wasn't just destructive impulse. It contained vital energy. It was the power he'd never been allowed to access, the assertiveness he'd been taught to suppress, the strength he'd channeled into being the calm, controlled physician. When he stopped fearing the rage and started working with it, he found his capacity to set boundaries, to speak truth, to stand his ground, to live with fierce authenticity rather than compliant performance. Even his shadow sexuality, the raw, inappropriate desires that had horrified him, contained something important. It was his life force, his creative energy, his connection to the instinctual, the wild, the untamed parts of being human. When he stopped being ashamed of it and started understanding it, He recognized that he'd been living an overly civilized, controlled, domesticated existence. The shadow sexuality was pointing toward aliveness, passion, full-bodied engagement with being human. This is what Jung meant by integration. You don't become your shadow. That would be inflation, possession, acting out. You don't eliminate your shadow. That's impossible and would leave you diminished. You bring it into consciousness. You dialogue with it. You learn from it. You incorporate its energy while maintaining your center. The paradox is this. As you integrate your shadow, you become simultaneously more humble and more powerful. More humble because you can no longer maintain the illusion of being only good, only light, only evolved. You see clearly that you contain everything, the saint and the sinner, the wise person and the fool, the healer and the wounder. You can't look down on anyone anymore because you recognize in yourself every quality you've judged in others. More powerful because you're no longer leaking energy through repression. The tremendous psychic energy required to keep your shadow unconscious, to maintain the splitting, to defend against seeing what you don't want to see, to project constantly onto others. That energy becomes available for conscious living. You're more present, more alive, more capable of responding to reality rather than reacting from unconscious complexes. Michael noticed this transformation viscerally. Before shadow integration, he was constantly exhausted, constantly defending, constantly managing his image and reactions. After beginning to integrate his shadow, even though the work was difficult, he had more energy. He was less reactive. He could be in uncomfortable situations without collapsing into old patterns. Someone would criticize him, and instead of becoming defensive, which required tremendous energy, he could simply consider, is that accurate? Is there truth in that? If yes, he could acknowledge it without shame. If no, he could dismiss it without needing to defend himself. Someone would trigger his rage, and instead of repressing it, which required constant vigilance, or acting it out, which caused harm, he could feel it, understand its message, and choose how to respond. The rage was no longer possessing him or requiring suppression, it was informing him. Someone would reveal their own shadow material, their selfishness, cruelty, or weakness, and instead of judging them, which was actually projection, or enabling them, which was codependency, Michael could simply see them clearly. Yes, I know. Those parts. I have those parts too. You're human, just like me. This is the compassion that emerges from shadow integration, not the false compassion of the ego that's really superiority disguised as kindness, but genuine recognition of shared humanity. Jung called this compassionate consciousness, seeing others accurately without judgment, because you've seen yourself accurately without judgment. But here's what makes shadow work so challenging. The shadow is culturally and personally specific. What's in your shadow depends on what your particular conditioning deemed unacceptable. If you were raised in a family where anger was terrifying, anger is in your shadow. If you were raised in a family where vulnerability was weakness, vulnerability is in your shadow. If you were raised in a culture where sexuality is shameful, sexuality is in your shadow. If you were raised in a religion where doubt is sin, doubt is in your shadow. If you were raised in a competitive environment where failure was catastrophic, your capacity to fail, to be average, to be human, is in your shadow. And here's the twist. Sometimes positive qualities are in your shadow. If you were raised to be humble, your confidence and power might be in the shadow. If you were raised to be selfless, your healthy self-interest is in the shadow. If you were raised to be rational, your intuition and mysticism are in the shadow. If you were raised to be serious, your playfulness and joy are in the shadow. Jung called this the golden shadow, the disowned positive qualities that are just as split off as the negative ones. And these must be integrated too. The person who can't access their power, who can't claim their brilliance, who can't allow themselves to shine. They have a golden shadow that needs integration as much as someone who can't acknowledge their darkness. Michael discovered his golden shadow through his music. He'd split off not just his rage and selfishness, but also his creativity, his sensitivity, his artistic nature, his capacity for beauty and wonder. These qualities were too threatening to the Dr. Michael persona, too impractical, too vulnerable, too unmasculine according to his father's model. Reclaiming them felt almost more dangerous than acknowledging his darkness. Acknowledging rage felt shameful, but at least felt powerful. Acknowledging his sensitivity, his aesthetic nature, his need for beauty, that felt weak, indulgent, inappropriate for a 44-year-old man with responsibilities. But Jung insisted the shadow is 90% gold. What you've been most ashamed of, most afraid to acknowledge, most committed to denying, that often contains your greatest gifts, your most authentic strengths, your deepest connection to your true self. So how do you do this work? How do you make the shadow visible and begin integration? Jung developed several practices, but the core method is what he called shadow recognition practice, a systematic approach to identifying and dialoguing with disowned material. Step 1. Notice your judgments. Whatever you judge most harshly in others is likely your own shadow material. If you find yourself thinking, "I can't stand selfish people," look for your own selfishness. If you're triggered by emotional people or controlling people or weak people, that's your shadow talking. Your strongest judgments are your clearest pointers to what you've disowned. Step 2. Examine your dreams. The shadow appears regularly in dreams as threatening figures, repulsive characters, criminals, monsters, or people you dislike. These aren't literal. They're symbolic representations of disowned parts of yourself. Michael's dream of killing patients wasn't about homicidal impulses. It was his shadow showing him the rage he'd repressed and the death of his false identity that needed to happen. Step 3. Track your projections. When you have intense emotional reactions to others, attraction, repulsion, envy, contempt, you're likely projecting. The person becomes a screen for your own unconscious material. Jung taught that you must withdraw the projections. Recognize that what you see in them exists in you. Step 4. Dialogue with shadow figures. Use active imagination to have conversations with the parts of yourself you've disowned. Visualize a shadow figure from dreams or imagination and ask it, "Who are you? What do you want? What are you trying to tell me? What happens if I keep you locked away?" Let it speak. Don't judge, interpret, or defend. Just listen. Step 5. Find the gift. Every shadow quality contains energy, information, or capacity you need. Rage contains power and boundary setting. Selfishness contains self-care and healthy limits. Cruelty contains the capacity to cut through delusion and refuse enabling. Weakness contains vulnerability and authenticity. Find what the shadow quality is trying to give you. Step 6. Integrate, don't act out. Integration doesn't mean expressing every shadow impulse. It means bringing the energy into consciousness and finding mature, conscious ways to honor what it represents. You don't become cruel, but you stop being a doormat. You don't become completely selfish, but you stop self-abandoning. You don't act out rage, but you access your power. Michael worked this process for nearly a year, and it fundamentally transformed his relationship to himself. He moved from "I am good," splitting, to "I am human," wholeness. He moved from "I'm not like those people," projection, to "I am like all people," compassion. He moved from "I must maintain my acceptable image," exhausting, to "I can be who I actually am," liberating. And here's what emerged from that transformation: authenticity, real authenticity. not the performance of authenticity that social media celebrates, not the curated version of being real, but actual undefended presence. When you've integrated your shadow, you have nothing left to hide. You've already acknowledged to yourself everything you've been most afraid others would discover. You've seen your own darkness, pettiness, weakness, and ugliness, and you've survived it, understood it, incorporated it. This creates an unshakable presence. People can criticize you, expose your flaws, reveal your failures, and none of it destabilizes you because you already know. You're not defending an image anymore. You're not protecting a false self. You're simply being what you actually are, a complete, flawed, contradictory, beautiful, terrible, wonderful human being. Jung said this is when real transformation becomes possible, not when you're trying to be good, but when you've integrated your capacity for evil and chosen consciousness over unconsciousness, not when you're performing enlightenment, but when you've acknowledged your darkness and brought it into the light. Let me ask you directly, what quality do you judge most harshly in others? What emotional reactions do you have that seem disproportionate? What appears in your dreams as threatening or repulsive? What parts of yourself do you spend the most energy denying? Comment below. I'm ready to see my shadow if you're willing to do the most difficult and most important work of the breaking free process, because until you integrate your shadow, you're not actually free. You're just performing a different role. The spiritual seeker, the conscious person, the awakened individual. And that's still the false self, just wearing more sophisticated clothing. True freedom comes from wholeness, from being rather whole than good, from containing multitudes without being possessed by any of them, from seeing yourself completely, light and darkness, strengths and weaknesses, saint and sinner, and saying, yes, this is what I am, all of it, and that's okay. When you reach that place, when you've truly integrated your shadow, something remarkable happens. The universe begins to speak to you directly, and that brings us to the fourth shift. After you've experienced identity dissolution, relationship transformation, and shadow integration, something begins happening that the rational mind struggles to explain. The universe appears to start speaking to you directly, not metaphorically, not as poetic language, but as actual, undeniable, repeated instances where the boundary between inner and outer, between psyche and matter, between subjective and objective, becomes mysteriously permeable. Carl Jung called these experiences synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that occur with no apparent causal relationship, but with obvious psychological significance. And he was emphatic that these weren't superstition, magical thinking, or delusion. They were evidence of something profound, that psyche and matter are two aspects of the same underlying reality. As the old self breaks free, as the ego's rigid control loosens, as consciousness opens to dimensions beyond the constructed identity, synchronicities begin, occurring with startling, undeniable frequency. You think of someone you haven't spoken to in years, and within hours they call, text, or appear in your life. You're struggling with a specific question, and a book falls off a shelf, open to the exact page that addresses that question. You need information or guidance, and a stranger appears who provides exactly what you need, then vanishes from your life as mysteriously as they appeared. You dream of something specific and encounter it the next day in waking reality, not symbolically, but literally. Numbers, animals, or symbols appear repeatedly with such frequency that dismissing them as random becomes more absurd than acknowledging them as meaningful. You experience timing so perfect, doors opening, opportunities appearing, obstacles dissolving, that it feels like an invisible intelligence is orchestrating events. Before experiencing this directly, most people have one of two reactions to synchronicity: dismissal, confirmation bias, selective attention, coincidence, Or magical inflation, the universe is sending me messages because I'm special. Neither response understands what Jung discovered. Synchronicity isn't the universe proving you're special. It's consciousness recognizing its participation in a reality that isn't divided into subject and object, inner and outer, psyche and matter. It's what becomes visible when the ego's interpretive filter weakens and you start perceiving more accurately. Michael's experience with synchronicity began right after his breaking free process accelerated, right after that dream of the crying child in his chest. He woke from that dream on a Saturday morning, completely disoriented. His wife had taken the kids to visit her parents, and he was alone in the house. He made coffee and sat in his living room, still feeling the emotional intensity of the dream, wondering what the hell was happening to him. He turned on his laptop with no particular intention and found an email in his inbox from Amazon. "Your order has shipped." But Michael hadn't ordered anything. He checked his account. Someone had used his account to purchase a book. The title, The Undiscovered Self, by Carl Jung. Michael's first reaction was annoyance. Someone had hacked his account. But as he sat with it, something felt strange. The timing was too perfect. He'd just had the most significant dream of his life, and a Jung book appeared. He decided not to report it as fraud. He'd let the book arrive and see. 3 days later, the book came. He opened it randomly, and his eyes fell on this sentence: "The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself, as well as others, think one is." Michael started crying. He didn't understand why Jung's words affected him so deeply, but they named something he'd never been able to articulate. He was living as something he wasn't. Everyone thought he was Dr. Michael. He thought he was Dr. Michael, but he wasn't. And that incongruence was destroying him. He read the entire book that night, and it was the first time anything had made sense of what he was experiencing. Jung wasn't pathologizing his identity dissolution. He was explaining it as a natural, necessary process of psychological development. The next synchronicity came a week later. Michael was at a coffee shop, trying to avoid the hospital cafeteria where he'd have to perform his doctor persona for colleagues. He overheard a conversation at the next table, 2 women discussing therapy. One said, "I finally found someone who understands what I'm going through, a Jungian analyst, Dr. Weiss. It's like he sees things no one else can see." Michael's body reacted before his mind did, a chill up his spine, a recognition he couldn't explain. He approached the women, apologized for eavesdropping, asked for the analyst's name, Dr. Abraham Weiss. That was it, just a name. But Michael knew immediately he was supposed to contact this person. When he got home, he searched for Dr. Weiss online. The analyst's photo struck him, not because he recognized the man, but because he recognized the quality in his eyes, a certain depth, a certain seeing. Michael had looked into thousands of eyes in the ER, had become skilled at reading people, and something in Dr. Weiss's eyes said, "This person knows something real." Michael called and got an appointment for the following week. He didn't tell anyone, not his wife, not his friends. He couldn't explain why he was doing it. He just knew he had to. The first session, Dr. Weiss listened to Michael's story without judgment, without pathologizing, without the medical model Michael was expecting. And then Dr. Weiss said something that changed everything. "Michael, what's happening to you isn't a breakdown. It's an emergency of emergence. Your authentic self is trying to break through decades of conditioning. And that book appearing, you overhearing my name, these aren't coincidences. They're synchronicities. The unconscious is guiding you toward what you need." Michael's rational mind resisted. He was a physician, a scientist. He'd been trained to dismiss this kind of thinking as superstition, but his lived experience said otherwise. The timing was too perfect, the sequences too meaningful, the feeling of being guided too palpable. Over the following months, as Michael worked with Dr. Weiss, as he went deeper into the breaking free process, the synchronicities multiplied dramatically. He decided to try playing piano again and mentioned it casually to a neighbor he rarely spoke to. The neighbor said, "Oh, my brother-in-law teaches piano. He just mentioned he has an opening. Want me to connect you?" The teacher turned out to be exactly what Michael needed, someone who understood music as soul expression, not technical performance. He found a journal he'd kept at age 11, before he'd abandoned music and poetry for medicine. He hadn't seen it in 30 years, had no memory of where it was stored. But one day, cleaning his garage, a box fell and the journal spilled out, open to a page where young Michael had written, "I want to make music that makes people feel what I feel inside. I want words to show people they're not alone." He was driving, feeling completely lost about whether leaving medicine was the right choice, when a song came on the radio, a song he hadn't heard since childhood, one his mother used to play. The lyrics were about someone finding courage to leave what they're supposed to be, to discover who they are. Michael pulled over and wept, feeling so directly addressed. It was as if the song was written specifically for him in that moment. He dreamed about a specific place, a cabin by a lake with a red door. 3 days later, scrolling through rental listings, he was considering leaving his house, getting some space. He saw that exact cabin, same lake, same red door. He rented it immediately, spent a month there alone, and it became the location where his most profound integration work happened. Jung would say these synchronicities weren't the universe rewarding Michael. They were evidence that as his consciousness expanded beyond the ego's narrow confines, he was beginning to perceive and participate in what Jung called the collective unconscious, the deeper layer of psyche that's shared across all humans, that connects inner and outer, that operates according to meaning rather than causation. The rational mind operates on causality. A causes B, which causes C. This works for manipulating physical reality, which is why science and technology are built on it. But Jung discovered that psyche operates on meaning, on symbolic connection, on patterns that transcend linear causation. Synchronicity is psyche recognizing itself in matter, consciousness recognizing that so-called external events are intimately connected to internal states, not because you're manifesting or attracting in some simplistic way, but because the division between inner and outer is less absolute than the ego believes. When you think of someone and they call, the rational mind says, coincidence. You think of lots of people who don't call, you just don't notice those. And that's partially true. But Jung would say, why that person? Why that timing? Why the emotional intensity? The connection is meaningful, even if it's not causal in the scientific sense. As the old self breaks free, several things happen that increase synchronistic experiences. First, the ego's interpretive filter weakens. The constructed self operates through rigid categories, filtering reality to maintain its worldview. As that structure dissolves, you start perceiving more subtleties, patterns, connections you had been unconsciously filtering out. Second, you become more attentive to the unconscious. Through dream work, active imagination, and shadow integration, you're developing a relationship with unconscious material. You're learning its language, symbols, images, feelings. That training helps you recognize when the unconscious is communicating through external events. Third, your relationship to control changes. The old self tried to control everything, to make things happen through will and effort. As it breaks free, you start surrendering, allowing, trusting, and in that receptive state, you notice guidance that was always present but which you'd been too busy controlling to perceive. Fourth, you're in a liminal state. Transitions, thresholds, in between places, these are when synchronicity is most common. You're not your old self anymore, but you're not yet your authentic self. You're in the undefined space between identities. And that's precisely when the unconscious becomes most active and most visible. Jung kept meticulous records of synchronistic events throughout his life, particularly during his own breaking free process, documented in the Red Book. He experienced visions, heard voices, encountered figures that seemed completely autonomous. At first he feared he was becoming psychotic, but he realized he was experiencing the collective unconscious directly. Archetypal forces that exist beyond personal psychology. The key distinction Jung made: if you become identified with synchronistic experiences, if you think they prove you're special or chosen or more evolved, that's inflation, the ego claiming ownership of transpersonal experiences. That's dangerous. But if you remain humble, if you recognize synchronicities as invitations to pay attention, as confirmations that you're on the right path, as evidence that reality is more mysterious and meaningful than the constructed self believed, then they serve the breaking free process beautifully. Michael learned to work with synchronicity through what Dr. Weiss called the synchronicity journal exercise. Every time something seemed meaningfully coincidental, Michael would write it down and reflect: what was I dealing with internally when this occurred? What is the symbolic or literal message? How does this connect to my breaking free process? What is this inviting me to pay attention to? How do I honor this without becoming inflated or superstitious? This practice helped Michael distinguish between genuine synchronicity and projection or magical thinking. Real synchronicity has a quality of numinosity, a sense of profound meaningfulness that's unmistakable when you experience it. It doesn't need interpretation or justification. You just know. And as Michael continued his journey, as his old self continued breaking free, the synchronicities became less dramatic but more constant. Not big theatrical coincidences, but a steady sense of being in dialogue with something larger than his personal psychology. He'd need information and the right book would appear. He'd need support and the right person would show up. He'd be blocked from one path and find another opening that he couldn't have planned, but which was clearly right. It felt like, and he struggled to articulate this without sounding crazy, like he'd gained a collaborator, like his authentic self was working with him, arranging things, providing what he needed exactly when he needed it. Jung would say, that's because he had gained a collaborator. The self, capital S, is the deeper intelligence within you, the wholeness you're moving toward through individuation. And as you align with it, as you stop resisting its guidance, as you trust its wisdom more than the ego's control, life begins to flow differently. Not easier necessarily, but more aligned, more meaningful, more clearly guided. This is what indigenous cultures have always known, what mystical traditions across time have taught. There's an intelligence operating in reality that transcends personal consciousness. You can call it the collective unconscious, the self, the Tao, God, the universe. The name doesn't matter. What matters is learning to perceive it, trust it, and collaborate with it. The old self was too defended, too controlling, too identified with ego to allow this collaboration. It needed to know, to control, to make things happen through personal will. As it breaks free, as the rigid boundaries dissolve, you discover you're not alone in this process. Something is helping, guiding, providing, and that recognition changes everything about how you move through life. Let me ask you, have you experienced synchronicities that felt too meaningful to dismiss? Moments when the timing was too perfect, the connections too significant, the guidance too clear to be random chance? Comment, the universe is speaking, if you've begun to notice these patterns. Share an example if you feel moved to, because naming synchronicities, acknowledging them, increases your attentiveness to them. Jung said, "Synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see. As the old self breaks free, your eyes are opening. You're beginning to see what's always been there, but which you were too defended, too rational, too ego-identified to perceive. And this opening leads directly to the fifth shift, where everything the old self worked toward suddenly loses all meaning, and that loss becomes the doorway to discovering what actually matters. There comes a moment in the breaking free process when something stops working, something that used to drive you, motivate you, give your life direction and purpose. It suddenly feels hollow, absurd, completely meaningless. The career advancement you'd been pursuing for years, you can't remember why it mattered. The achievement you'd been working toward, it feels pointless. The social status you'd been building, it seems embarrassingly superficial. The material accumulation you'd been focused on, you can't generate any enthusiasm for it. The competition you'd been engaged in, you suddenly see it as a game you never actually wanted to play. This is the fifth shift, and it's one of the most disorienting, because it leaves you without the goals and motivations that organized your life. Carl Jung called this the revaluation of values. What the ego prized becomes irrelevant as the self's deeper values begin to emerge. And it's terrifying because you're caught between two worlds. The old goals no longer motivate you, but the new values haven't fully crystallized yet. You're in a vacuum of meaning, and the cultural pressure to get back on track becomes intense. Michael experienced this shift about 8 months into his breaking free process. He'd been on leave from the hospital, ostensibly dealing with stress and burnout, with the plan to return once he felt better. But as the weeks passed, as he did the work with Dr. Weiss, as his old self continued to dissolve, he realized he had no desire to return, not just to that specific hospital, to medicine itself, to the entire career he'd built for 20 years. His colleagues would call to check in. "We miss you, Michael. When are you coming back? The ER isn't the same without you." And Michael would make non-committal responses because he couldn't articulate what was happening. "I don't care anymore. The thing I've dedicated my entire adult life to feels completely meaningless." His wife was increasingly frustrated. "You worked so hard to become a doctor. You're respected, you're successful, you're well paid, and now you just don't want to do it? What changed?" Everything changed. But how could he explain that? The goals that drove Dr. Michael, helping people, being respected, financial security, professional success, these weren't bad goals. They just weren't his goals. They were internalized from his father, from cultural conditioning, from the false self he'd constructed. And now that the false self was breaking free, its agenda was dying with it. This is crucial to understand. The old self's goals weren't random. They were carefully designed to maintain and validate the false identity. The achiever's goal isn't actually accomplishment. It's proving worthiness. The goal serves the identity. I am someone who achieves, therefore I am valuable. The accumulator's goal isn't actually wealth, it's proving security. The goal serves the identity. I have enough, therefore I am safe. The competitor's goal isn't actually winning, it's proving superiority. The goal serves the identity. I am better than others, therefore I am significant. The helper's goal isn't actually service, it's proving indispensability. The goal serves the identity. People need me, therefore I matter. The old self doesn't pursue goals for their own sake. It pursues goals that reinforce its constructed identity, that provide evidence for its false self-concept, that maintain its defensive structure. Michael's goal had been to be the perfect physician, competent, dedicated, unflappable. But that goal wasn't about medicine. It was about proving he was worthy of his father's sacrifice, about justifying his abandonment of his authentic passions, about maintaining the constructed identity that kept him safe from the terrifying question, who would I be if I wasn't Dr. Michael? As that identity dissolved, the goal lost all meaning. He'd achieved it anyway. He was an excellent physician, respected and relied upon. But the achievement felt empty because it was an achievement for someone who didn't actually exist. Dr. Michael had accomplished his goals, but the real Michael, the one emerging from beneath the construction, didn't care about those goals. They weren't his. This is the devastating realization of the fifth shift. You've spent years, sometimes decades, pursuing goals that weren't yours. You've climbed a ladder only to discover it was leaning against the wrong wall. You've won a game you never wanted to play. The woman who's climbed the corporate ladder to VP discovers she doesn't care about becoming CEO. The achievement-oriented student who's maintained perfect grades discovers they don't care about the Ivy League acceptance. The social climber who's finally gained entry to elite circles discovers they find those circles tedious and suffocating, and the people around them don't understand. You're so close. Why would you stop now? Because close to a goal you don't actually want is further from yourself than you can tolerate. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly in midlife. People would come to him in their 40s and 50s, outwardly successful but inwardly empty. They'd achieved everything they'd set out to achieve and felt nothing, or worse than nothing, despair at the realization that they'd spent their one life pursuing someone else's definition of success. He called this the midlife crisis, though it can happen at any age when the old self begins to crack. It's not about wanting a sports car or a young lover. Those are just symptoms. It's about the collapse of the ego's agenda and the terrifying void that opens when you realize you don't know what you actually want. This looks like depression to conventional psychology, loss of motivation, lack of interest in previous activities, sense of meaninglessness, inability to engage with life. These are diagnostic criteria for major depressive disorder. But Jung distinguished between two types of meaninglessness. Nihilistic depression, nothing matters, life is pointless, there's no reason to do anything. This is pathological, a collapse into despair, often stemming from trauma, chemical imbalance, or overwhelming loss. It feels dead, hopeless, final. Spiritual reorientation. The things I thought mattered don't, but I'm discovering what actually does. This is developmental, a necessary stage in the breaking free process. It feels disorienting, uncertain, but fundamentally alive. There's a quality of seeking rather than giving up. Michael learned to distinguish between these in his own experience. There were days that felt like genuine depression, heavy, dark, hopeless. On those days, he needed support, sometimes medication, always compassion. He was processing grief, loss, and the dissolution of his entire identity. That's legitimately depressing. But there were other days that felt different. Empty, yes. Unmotivated, yes, but not hopeless. These were days when the old motivations had died, but new ones hadn't emerged yet. These were the vacuum days, uncomfortable but necessary, like the pause between breaths, the silence between notes. Dr. Weiss introduced him to a practice Jung called the value excavation exercise, a method for distinguishing between conditioned goals and soul-level callings. For each goal you've been pursuing, ask, where did this goal come from? Did I choose it consciously, or did I absorb it unconsciously? Whose voice is speaking when I say this matters? Mine, my parents, my culture's. When did I first decide this was important? Was I even old enough to make that decision authentically? What does achieving this goal prove? What identity does it validate? What am I trying to demonstrate or defend? What would it mean about me if I achieved this? If I didn't achieve this? How does pursuing this goal feel? Is there aliveness in it, or just obligation? Does it expand me or deplete me? Am I moving towards something I want or away from something I fear? What would I pursue if no one was watching? If achievement brought no external validation, would I still want this? If my family never knew, if my culture never acknowledged it, if social media never saw it, would I still care? When Michael did this exercise honestly, systematically examining every goal he'd been pursuing, he made a shocking discovery. Almost none of them were actually his. Medical career, his father's unlived dream, professional respect, proving he was worthy of the sacrifice. Financial success, demonstrating he hadn't wasted the opportunity. Perfect family, completing the American dream narrative. Constant productivity, avoiding the empty feeling that arose whenever he stopped. The only thing he'd ever pursued that felt authentically chosen was music and writing, and he'd abandoned those at age 12 when they conflicted with the Dr. Michael identity. This realization was simultaneously devastating and liberating. Devastating because he'd spent 32 years of his life pursuing goals that weren't his own. Liberating because he could finally stop. But here's where it gets complicated. You can't just abandon all goals and drift. That's regression, not transformation. Jung emphasized that the death of the ego's agenda must be followed by the emergence of the self's purpose. But there's often a gap, sometimes months, sometimes years, between the death and the emergence. Michael spent nearly a year in this gap. He'd left medicine, but he didn't know what he was moving toward. He had no clear goals, no 5-year plan, no vision of success. The absence of ambition felt simultaneously peaceful and terrifying. His family struggled with this. His teenage daughter asked, "Dad, what do you want to be when you grow up?" She meant it as a joke, but it cut deep because Michael didn't have an answer. His son stopped talking about him at school. "What does your dad do?" "He used to be a doctor." The past tense felt like failure. Society has no category for this. You're supposed to always be striving, always improving, always pursuing the next level. The cultural narrative is relentless. If you're not growing, you're dying. If you're not achieving, you're failing. If you don't have goals, you're lost. But Jung said something radically different. Your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes. The old self looked outside, at cultural definitions of success, at parental expectations, at comparison with others. The emerging self looks inside, at what's actually true, at what genuinely matters, at what the soul is calling for. And here's what Michael discovered during his goalless year. In the absence of external striving, internal guidance became audible. When he wasn't pursuing achievement, he noticed what brought him alive. Playing piano, writing in his journal, long walks in nature, deep conversations, helping his children with homework, not from obligation, but from genuine enjoyment. Cooking a meal with full presence, reading philosophy and psychology late at night. These weren't goals. They were expressions of being. They didn't lead anywhere. They didn't prove anything. They didn't validate any identity. They were just alive, real, authentic, and gradually, organically, without forcing or planning, a different kind of purpose began to emerge. Not a goal in the old sense, not I will achieve X by date Y to prove I am Z, but a sense of direction, of calling, of what Jung called vocation, not a job, but a way of being in the world that serves something larger than personal ego. Michael found himself drawn to helping other physicians who were burning out, who were questioning whether medicine was their path, who were experiencing the same identity crisis he'd been through. He started writing about his experience, posting it online. He was shocked when hundreds of doctors responded, "This is exactly what I'm experiencing. I thought I was alone. I thought something was wrong with me." He wasn't trying to build a career or achieve success. He was simply responding to what felt authentic, what naturally wanted to emerge. But it started to take form. Consulting with physicians in crisis, speaking at medical conferences about burnout and authenticity, eventually training as a coach specializing in career transition for healthcare professionals. This wasn't a goal he'd set. It emerged from the work he'd done, from the death of his false self, from the space created when old goals dissolved. Jung would call this following your diamond, the inner genius, the calling that's unique to you, the purpose that serves both your individuation and the collective good. The crucial distinction: the old self's goals were about becoming something. I will become successful, respected, accomplished, secure. The emerging self's purpose is about expressing something. This is what wants to come through me, what I'm here to offer, what authentically moves through my particular consciousness. Old goals are exhausting because you're always chasing something you don't have, trying to become someone you're not, proving something that can never be finally proven. Emerging purpose is energizing because you're expressing what you already are, manifesting what naturally flows through you, serving something that doesn't require proof. But, and this is critical, you can't skip the goalless period. You can't rush from old goals are meaningless to here's my new authentic purpose without the intervening space. That space, that void, that time when nothing motivates you and you don't know what you want, that's not a problem to solve. It's a necessary phase of the transformation. Jung called it incubation. Like a caterpillar in the cocoon, you're not supposed to have goals during this time. You're supposed to dissolve, to liquefy, to let the old form completely break down before the new form can emerge. The culture will pressure you. You need to get back out there. You need to set new goals. You need a plan. And you might need to perform having plans to keep people calm. But internally, the authentic purpose can't be manufactured. It can only be discovered. And discovery requires space, silence, uncertainty, and patience. Michael learned to honor this by creating what he called purposeful purposelessness, structured time for doing nothing goal-oriented, an hour each morning just sitting with coffee, no agenda, a day each week with no plans, no productivity, no achievement, a month each year on retreat, disconnected from all the goal-driven energy of culture. This wasn't laziness or avoidance. It was creating space for the authentic self to emerge. And in that space, gradually, organically, his real purpose began to clarify, not as a goal to achieve, but as a reality to embody. Here's what you need to understand if you're experiencing this shift. Losing motivation for old goals isn't depression or failure. It's a sign that the false self's agenda is dying and that death is necessary. Your job isn't to force new goals, to manufacture enthusiasm, or to get back to normal functioning. Your job is to honor the void. Don't rush to fill it with new goals that are just the old goals in different packaging. Grieve the loss. You spent years pursuing those goals. Even if they weren't yours, their absence creates loss. Let yourself feel it. Question everything, every goal, every ambition, every should. Trace it back. Is it yours or is it conditioned? Notice what brings aliveness, not what brings success, validation, or approval. What brings the felt sense of being authentically engaged. Trust the process. The authentic purpose will emerge when the false self has died enough to make space for it. Resist cultural pressure. Society will call you lost, unmotivated, depressed. You're not. You're transforming. And here's the paradox Jung observed. When you stop pursuing the ego's goals, you often achieve more than you did when you were striving, not because you're trying to achieve, but because you're expressing what's authentic. And authentic expression has a power that forced striving never does. Michael ended up more professionally successful, more financially secure, and more respected in his new work than he'd been as a physician, not because he was trying to be successful, but because he was finally doing what was actually his to do. The difference was palpable. Before, he was performing someone else's life. After, he was living his own. But the metric wasn't success. It was meaning. Did his life feel meaningful? Did his days feel alive? Did his work serve something beyond his ego? These became the questions that mattered. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not to achieve what culture says you should achieve, not to succeed by someone else's definition, but to discover what's authentically yours, and to live from that, regardless of external validation." Let me ask you, what goals have you been pursuing that you're starting to realize aren't actually yours? What ambitions feel hollow now? What achievements feel meaningless? What are you striving for because you think you should, rather than because you authentically want to? Comment, "My goals are dying," if you're experiencing this shift. And know this, you're not losing your way, you're finding it. The death of false goals is the birth canal of authentic purpose. But as these old goals lose their power, as your consciousness opens to what actually matters, something else begins to intensify. Your dreams become vivid, overwhelming, impossible to ignore. And that's where we go next. There comes a moment in every human life when the ground beneath you, the ground you believed was solid, permanent, made of something real, begins to tremble. Not from some outer catastrophe, though catastrophe may accompany it. No, this trembling comes from within, from a place so deep you have spent your entire life avoiding it. It is the soul's first whisper of truth. You are not who you think you are, and in that whisper, everything begins to fall. Carl Jung understood this collapse as sacred. He knew that the breaking of the old self is not destruction for its own sake, not some cruel unraveling orchestrated by an indifferent universe. It is revelation. It is the tearing away of the veil you draped over your own face so long ago that you forgot you were wearing it. The persona, that carefully constructed mask you present to the world, the role you have been playing since childhood, begins to crack, and beneath the cracks, something older, something truer begins to stir. This is the first initiation, the disintegration of the false self. You have spent years building this identity. You have chosen your words carefully, sculpted your behaviors to fit the expectations of others, pruned away the parts of yourself that seemed unacceptable, inconvenient, or unsafe. You became the good son, the dutiful daughter, the successful professional, the dependable friend. You learned to smile when you felt empty, to nod when you disagreed, to silence the voice inside you that screamed for something more. And for a time, it worked. The world rewarded you. It gave you approval, security, a place to belong. But the soul does not care for safety. The soul cares for truth. And so the persona, that beautiful lie, begins to fracture. Perhaps it happens suddenly, a crisis, a betrayal, a moment of profound disillusionment that shatters the illusion all at once. Or perhaps it happens slowly, a quiet erosion, a growing sense that the life you are living is not your own. Either way, the mask slips, and when it does, you are left staring at the terrifying question, if I am not this, then who am I? This is where most people turn back. They reach for the mask, desperate to glue it together, to return to the known, the comfortable, the false. But you, if you are reading this, if you have come this far, you do not turn back. You let the mask fall. You step into the void. And in that void, you meet the shadow. The shadow is everything you disowned. It is every impulse you buried, every desire you shamed, every part of yourself you deemed too dark, too messy, too much. Jung called it the personal unconscious, the repository of all that you could not accept about yourself. It is your rage, your lust, your pettiness, your greed. It is also your brilliance, your power, your wildness, your joy, anything you were taught to fear or suppress. The shadow is not evil, it is simply unseen, and what is unseen does not disappear, it waits. When the persona collapses, the shadow rises. It demands to be acknowledged, to be felt, to be integrated. This is the second initiation, the confrontation with what you have hidden from yourself. You may see it first in your projections, the people you hate, the behaviors that trigger you, the qualities you judge most harshly in others. These are mirrors. They are showing you the disowned parts of yourself, the fragments you cast into the darkness because you believed they would make you unlovable. But the shadow does not want to be loved. It wants to be seen. It wants you to stop pretending. It wants you to admit that you are not only light, but also darkness, not only kind, but also cruel, not only selfless, but also selfish. You are human. You are whole. You are both. And when you finally stop running from the shadow, when you turn and face it, something extraordinary happens. You descend. This is the third initiation, the descent into the inner abyss, what Jung called the Nekia, the night sea journey. You are pulled down into the depths of the unconscious, into the mythic underworld where the ego cannot follow. This is not a metaphor, it is a lived experience, a psychological death that feels as real as any physical ending. The structures of your identity dissolve. The beliefs that once gave your life meaning crumble. The future you imagined for yourself evaporates. You are unmoored, adrift in a sea of chaos and confusion. In the ancient myths, the hero always descends before they can be reborn. Inanna descends into the underworld and is stripped naked, hung on a hook, left to rot. Persephone is dragged into the depths by Hades, separated from everything she knows. Orpheus journeys into the land of the dead to retrieve his lost love. Jung himself experienced this descent during his confrontation with the unconscious, a period he called his Nekia, when he was flooded with visions, voices, and images that threatened to overwhelm him entirely. He did not emerge the same man. Neither will you. In this abyss, you lose everything. You lose your certainty. You lose your identity. You lose the story you told yourself about who you are and what your life means. And in that loss, you encounter the void, the fertile nothingness from which all creation springs. This is not emptiness as absence. This is emptiness as potential. The egg before it cracks, the seed before it sprouts, the silence before the first note of a new song. Here, in the darkest part of the journey, you face the fourth initiation, the loss of meaning that births new purpose. For years, you derived your meaning from external sources, your work, your relationships, your accomplishments, your beliefs. These were the pillars that held up the structure of your life. But when the old self collapses, these pillars crumble too. The career that once defined you feels hollow. The relationships that once sustained you feel suffocating. The beliefs you inherited from your family, your culture, your religion, they no longer fit. They are too small for what you are becoming. This is the existential crisis Jung spoke of, the confrontation with meaninglessness that every individuating soul must face. It is terrifying. It is disorienting. It is also necessary, because you cannot discover your own meaning while you are still living someone else's. You cannot hear the voice of your soul while you are drowning out its whispers with borrowed certainties. So you sit in the void. You let the old meanings die. You resist the urge to grasp for new ones too quickly, to fill the emptiness with another set of beliefs that will someday also fail you. Instead, you wait. You listen. You allow the darkness to teach you what the light never could. That meaning is not found. It is forged. It is not given. It is born. And it does not come from the outside. It comes from within. As you wait in this pregnant silence, another layer of the false self begins to peel away. This is the fifth initiation, the death of borrowed beliefs. You have been living by scripts you never wrote, rules you never questioned, values you never chose. Some of them served you once, protected you, helped you navigate a world that was too big and too dangerous for the child you were. But you are not that child anymore, and the beliefs that once sheltered you have become a prison. Jung understood that individuation requires the shedding of the collective, the unexamined assumptions, the cultural conditioning, the ancestral patterns that live inside you like ghosts. You must ask, what do I believe because I truly believe it? And what do I believe because I was told to? This is not easy work. It means questioning everything, your religion, your politics, your ideas about success, love, morality, purpose. It means standing alone outside the safety of the herd and claiming your own authority. This death is not dramatic. It is quiet, intimate, ruthless. One by one, you release the beliefs that are not yours. You let them go, even when letting go feels like betrayal, even when it means disappointing the people you love, even when it leaves you standing in a void with nothing to hold on to. You become a heretic to your own history, and in that heresy you find freedom. But freedom is not the end. It is the beginning of something even more bewildering, even more profound, because just when you think you have reached the bottom, just when you believe you have lost everything there is to lose, the universe flips. This is the sixth and final initiation of the collapse, enantiodromia, the sudden reversal where everything inverts and opposites collide. Jung borrowed this term from the philosopher Heraclitus, who observed that everything, when pushed to its extreme, transforms into its opposite. Day becomes night, love becomes hate, order becomes chaos, and the self that has been broken down, stripped bare, reduced to its essence, this self, in its utter dissolution, begins to transform into something new. Enantiodromia is the alchemical moment when the lead of suffering turns to gold, when the descent into darkness becomes the ascent into light. But it is not a gentle transition. It is a collision of opposites, a thunderclap in the psyche. The shadow you feared becomes your strength. The weakness you hid becomes your power. The death you mourned becomes your rebirth. Everything you thought was true inverts, and what was once down is now up. What was once end is now beginning. This is the moment when the ego, exhausted from its resistance, finally surrenders. It realizes it cannot control this process, cannot manage or manipulate its way through. It must die, not literally but symbolically. The ego must step aside and allow the self, that deeper, vaster intelligence Jung called the archetype of wholeness, to take the lead. And in that surrender, something miraculous happens. The six initiations, the collapse of the persona, the confrontation with the shadow, the descent into the abyss, the loss of meaning, the death of borrowed beliefs, and the great reversal. These are not separate events. They are one continuous unfolding, one sacred alchemy. They are the death that is required before any true rebirth can occur. You are not being destroyed. You are being revealed. The old self is not your enemy. It was simply a cocoon, a necessary stage in your becoming. But the time has come to break free. The chrysalis is dissolving. The caterpillar you were is liquefying into primordial essence. And from that essence, something winged and luminous is beginning to form. You cannot see it yet. You are still in the darkness, still in the midst of the great unraveling. But deep in the unconscious, where the self resides, the work is already underway. The soul is remembering what it always was. Not the mask, not the role, not the story you told to survive, but the raw, unformed, infinite potential that has been waiting, patient and eternal, for this exact moment. The collapse is not the end. It is the invitation. The ego resists, but the self calls louder, and you, exhausted, stripped bare, standing in the ruins of everything you thought you knew, you finally answer. You step forward into the unknown. You let the old self break free, and in doing so, you begin, at last, to become whole. After the breaking comes the becoming. After the descent, the return. After the death, the resurrection that was promised not by doctrine, but by the very architecture of the psyche itself. You have been in the underworld. You have walked through the valley of shadows, through the dissolution of everything you once believed yourself to be. You have let the old self die, not once but 1,000 times in 1,000 small surrenders. And now, in the aftermath of that sacred collapse, something new begins to stir, not imposed from without, but emerging from within, not borrowed, but born. This is the alchemical transformation Jung devoted his life to understanding. The movement from fragmentation to wholeness, from persona to self, from lead to gold. The second half of the journey is not a different path. It is the same path, but walked in the opposite direction. You are returning, but you are not returning to who you were. You are returning to who you have always been, beneath the layers of conditioning, beneath the masks, beneath the fear. The first resurrection is the most paradoxical, the integration of shadow into light. You have met your shadow. You have confronted the parts of yourself you disowned, the impulses you buried, the desires you shamed into silence. But confrontation is not integration. Seeing the shadow is not the same as embracing it, claiming it, weaving it back into the fabric of your being. Most people, when they encounter their shadow, do one of two things. They recoil in horror and bury it again, deeper this time, or they identify with it completely and become consumed by it. Swinging from repression to possession, Jung taught a third way, integration. Integration means you no longer split yourself into good and bad, acceptable and unacceptable, light and dark. You recognize that the shadow contains not only your demons, but also your disowned power, your unexpressed creativity, your authentic desires. The rage you suppressed might be the boundary you need to set. The selfishness you denied might be the self-care you've been starving for. The darkness you feared might be the depth that makes your light meaningful. When you integrate the shadow, you stop performing goodness and start embodying wholeness. You stop pretending to be only virtuous and start admitting you are human, complex, contradictory, capable of both cruelty and compassion. This is not moral relativism. This is psychological honesty. It is the recognition that the parts of yourself you exile do not disappear. They simply operate outside your awareness, sabotaging you, projecting themselves onto others, manifesting as symptoms and synchronicities, until you finally pay attention. So, you pay attention. You bring the shadow into the light, not to destroy it, but to understand it, to befriend it, to alchemize it. You take the raw, rejected material of your psyche and you transform it into strength, into wisdom, into the fuel for your becoming. The monster you feared becomes your ally. The weakness becomes your foundation. The wound becomes the womb of your rebirth. And as you integrate your shadow, something unexpected happens. You find your voice. This is the second resurrection, the birth of authentic voice. For so long you spoke in borrowed words. You said what you thought you should say, what would keep you safe, what would make others comfortable. Your voice was filtered through 1,000 invisible agreements, with your family, your culture, your fear. You learned early that certain truths were not welcome, that certain feelings were too much, that certain parts of you needed to be edited, softened, silenced. But the old self has broken free, and with it the old voice, the careful, performative, people-pleasing voice, has died. In its place, Something raw and real begins to speak. At first, it is tentative, unsure. You are not used to saying what you actually think, feeling what you actually feel, expressing what you actually desire. It feels dangerous, it feels exposing, it is. But with each word you speak from your authentic center, you reclaim a piece of your soul. You stop seeking permission for your own experience. You stop apologizing for taking up space. You begin to understand that your voice is not just sound, it is sovereignty. It is the declaration of your inner authority, the assertion of your right to exist as you are, not as you have been told to be. Jung spoke of this as the emergence of the true personality, the self speaking through the individual, rather than the ego performing for the collective. Your voice becomes a channel for something deeper than opinion or preference. It becomes the expression of your soul's truth, your particular frequency in the great symphony of existence. And when you speak from this place, even if your words tremble, even if your voice shakes, there is a power in it that cannot be denied, because it is not you speaking, it is the self finally given permission to be heard. As your voice clarifies, you begin to notice something else shifting, your desires. This is the third resurrection, the reclamation of rejected desires. You have spent your life denying what you truly want. You learned to want what you were supposed to want, the right career, the right relationship, the right life path. You learned to suppress the desires that didn't fit, that seemed selfish or impractical or shameful. You told yourself you didn't really want those things anyway, that you were content with less, that sacrifice was noble and longing was dangerous. But the soul does not forget. Your true desires, the ones you buried, the ones you dismissed, the ones you convinced yourself were childish or impossible, they have been waiting. And now, in the aftermath of the great collapse, they return, not as demands, but as whispers, not as distractions, but as directions. Jung understood that desire is not the enemy of spiritual growth. It is the compass, your authentic desires, not the addictive cravings or compensatory fantasies, but the deep, soul-level longings. These are the breadcrumbs leading you back to yourself. They are the self's way of guiding you toward your unique path, your particular expression of being. So you begin to reclaim them, the creative projects you abandoned, the relationships you denied yourself, the life you secretly wanted but were too afraid to pursue. You stop performing contentment and start admitting hunger. You stop pretending you are satisfied with scraps and start demanding the feast your soul is starving for. This is not hedonism, this is homecoming. It is the recognition that you are allowed to want what you want, that your desires are not obstacles to your wholeness, but expressions of it. When you honor your authentic desires, you honor the self. You stop living someone else's life and start living your own. And as you reclaim your desires, you begin to notice a deeper pattern emerging. The fragments are coming together. The scattered pieces of your psyche are finding their rightful places. This is the fourth resurrection, the embodiment of symbolic wholeness. Jung called this process individuation, the journey toward becoming a complete, undivided individual, the integration of all the disparate parts of the psyche into a unified whole. It is not perfection, it is wholeness, and there is a profound difference. Perfection is the ego's fantasy, the belief that you can be only one thing, good, successful, enlightened, beyond reproach. Wholeness is the self's reality, the recognition that you contain multitudes. You are masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, order and chaos. You are all of it, woven together in a tapestry so intricate and unique that no one else could ever replicate it. This wholeness is not an achievement, it is an acceptance. It is the moment when you stop trying to excise the parts of yourself that don't fit the image and start embracing the full spectrum of your being. You no longer need to be one-dimensional. You can be contradictory, paradoxical, complex. You can be strong and vulnerable, confident and uncertain, joyful and melancholic, sometimes all at once. Jung often spoke of the mandala, the circular symbol of wholeness that appears spontaneously in the dreams and artwork of individuating souls. The mandala is the self's signature, the geometric proof that the psyche is organizing itself around a center. You are becoming that mandala. The scattered fragments of your identity are no longer at war with each other. They are finding their harmony, their balance, their place in the larger pattern. And as this wholeness takes shape, you begin to feel something you have never felt before: inner authority. This is the fifth resurrection, the emergence of inner authority, the moment when you no longer need external validation to know who you are or what is true for you. For most of your life, you looked outside yourself for answers. You asked the experts, the authorities, the gurus, the traditions. You sought permission, approval, guidance. You needed someone else to tell you that you were on the right path, that your choices were valid, that your life had meaning. This is not weakness, it is the natural stage of development. We all begin as children, dependent on the wisdom of others. But individuation demands that you grow beyond this dependence. It demands that you become your own authority, not in arrogance or isolation, but in humble recognition of your sovereignty. You are the only one who can live your life. You are the only one who knows the language of your soul. The teachers and guides and mentors, they can point the way, but they cannot walk the path for you. So you stop asking, "What should I do?" and start asking, "What does my self know?" You stop seeking validation and start trusting your inner knowing. You develop what Jung called the ethical personality, the capacity to stand alone, to make choices based on your own conscience rather than collective morality, to take responsibility for your own becoming. This does not mean you reject all external wisdom. It means you metabolize it, filter it through your own experience, claim what resonates and release what doesn't. You become discerning rather than obedient. You become sovereign rather than submissive. You bow to no altar but the one within. And in that sovereignty you finally arrive at the culmination of the journey, the ultimate resurrection, individuation itself, the alchemical gold born from psychological lead. This is the sixth and final resurrection. And it is not an ending, but a beginning. Individuation is not a destination you reach. It is a process you enter, a way of being you embody for the rest of your life. It is the soul's answer to the question, what does it mean to become fully yourself? Jung taught that individuation is the realization of the self, the moment when the ego stops believing it is the center of the psyche and recognizes it is merely the servant of something far greater. The self is the archetype of wholeness, the totality of the psyche, the God image within. It is not separate from you, it is the deepest truth of you, the essence that has been orchestrating your entire journey, guiding you through the collapse and the resurrection, the death and the rebirth. When you individuate, you stop living reactively and start living creatively. You stop being tossed by the waves of circumstance and start moving from your center. You no longer need to prove yourself, defend yourself, or explain yourself. You simply are. You exist in the fullness of your being, undisguised, unashamed, unapologetic. This is the promise Jung made to every soul brave enough to undertake the journey, that the breaking is not the end, that the pain has purpose, that the darkness is not empty but pregnant with potential. The old self had to break free, not into chaos but into coherence, not into emptiness but into essence. What remains is no longer a role, but a presence, no longer a mask but a face, the soul at last undisguised. You are no longer performing for the world. You are no longer fragmented into acceptable and unacceptable parts. You have integrated the shadow, found your voice, reclaimed your desires, embodied wholeness, claimed your authority, and stepped into individuation. You move through life now with quiet sovereignty, with the calm assurance of someone who has died and been reborn, who has descended into hell and returned with the treasure. The world may not understand you. The collective may not approve. But you are no longer living for the world or the collective. You are living for the self, in service to the mystery that called you into being, that guided you through the darkness, that never abandoned you even when you felt most alone. This is the return of the sovereign self. This is the resurrection Jung promised. Not transcendence, but embodiment. Not escape, but engagement. Not perfection, but wholeness. You are home, not in a place, but in yourself. And from this home, this center, this hard-won authenticity, you finally begin to live. Not the life you were told to live, but the life you were born to live. The one only you can live. The one the world has been waiting for. Carl Jung explained, 8 hidden signs. The emotions you carry aren't truly yours. Jung's most dangerous discovery wasn't about mental illness or dream analysis. It was about emotional possession, the terrifying realization that most people are walking around completely unconscious of the fact that 80% of what they feel isn't actually theirs. What I'm about to tell you will fundamentally change how you understand every emotion you've ever experienced. Carl Jung uncovered something so disturbing about human consciousness that he initially kept it hidden from his patients, buried in his private journals, revealed only to his most trusted colleagues. You are carrying emotional baggage that doesn't belong to you. Right now, as you listen to these words, you are likely experiencing feelings that originated in other people's unprocessed trauma, ancestral wounds that stretch back generations, and collective emotional patterns that have infected your psyche like invisible viruses. This isn't metaphysical speculation or New Age wishful thinking. This is hard psychological science that Jung documented through decades of clinical observation. He called it psychic contagion, the unconscious absorption of other people's emotional states until you can no longer distinguish between your authentic feelings and the borrowed emotions you've accumulated throughout your lifetime. Think about the last time you felt inexplicably sad, anxious, or angry. You probably assumed these feelings were natural responses to your life circumstances. But what if I told you that sadness might belong to your grandmother's ungrieved losses, that anxiety could be your mother's unexpressed terror, that rage might be carrying your father's buried disappointments? Jung discovered that most human beings never develop what he termed emotional sovereignty, the psychological ability to differentiate between their authentic emotional responses and the foreign feelings they've unconsciously absorbed from family members, romantic partners, co-workers, friends, and even complete strangers. The result is a devastating form of psychological pollution where sensitive individuals become emotional dumping grounds. They carry rage that belongs to their fathers, depression inherited from their grandmothers, anxiety absorbed from their spouses, fear picked up from the collective unconscious itself. You've probably experienced this without knowing what was happening. You meet someone and suddenly feel inexplicably drained. You enter certain environments and your mood shifts dramatically. You have emotional reactions that surprise even you, feelings so intense and foreign that you wonder where they came from. Jung called this phenomenon participation mystique, a primitive psychological state where boundaries between self and other dissolve completely. In healthy development, we learn to maintain what he termed conscious differentiation. But millions of people never escape this merged state. They live their entire lives carrying emotions that don't belong to them, making decisions based on borrowed feelings, trapped in psychological patterns that originated in other people's unresolved trauma. The 8 signs I'm about to reveal will help you identify when you're experiencing emotional possession rather than authentic feeling. But I have to warn you, this knowledge comes with a price. Once you see how much of your emotional life has been contaminated by others' unprocessed content, you can never go back to unconscious living. You'll begin questioning every feeling, examining every mood, tracing every emotional pattern back to its true source. Some people find this liberating, others find it terrifying. Because what happens when you discover that the emotions you thought defined your personality were never actually yours? Jung believed this awakening was essential for psychological health. He argued that emotional sovereignty, the ability to feel your authentic responses without contamination from others' unprocessed content, was the foundation of what he called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are. But here's what Jung discovered that will shock you. Developing emotional sovereignty doesn't make you less empathetic or compassionate. It makes you more authentically caring because you're responding from your genuine emotional center rather than borrowed feelings that create confusion, reactivity, and unconscious emotional transmission. The people who master emotional differentiation become what Jung called conscious vessels, individuals who can hold space for others' pain without absorbing it into their own psychological system. They can offer genuine healing presence because they're not contaminated by the very emotions they're trying to help others process. This transformation is possible for anyone willing to do the inner work, but it requires courage. The courage to discover who you actually are beneath all the feelings you've been carrying for other people. The willingness to give back emotions that don't belong to you, even if they've become familiar companions. The 8 signs you're about to learn aren't just diagnostic tools. They're keys to emotional liberation, pathways to reclaiming your authentic feeling nature, doorways to discovering the pristine clarity of your uncontaminated emotional landscape. Are you ready to find out which emotions are truly yours? Are you prepared to discover what your authentic feeling nature looks like when it's no longer carrying the weight of everyone else's unprocessed psychological content? Because once you recognize these hidden signs of emotional possession, you'll begin the most liberating journey of your psychological life, learning to return borrowed feelings to their rightful owners and stepping into the profound freedom of emotional sovereignty. We are living through an unprecedented crisis of emotional contamination that Carl Jung predicted would become a mass phenomenon in the modern world. What he observed in his clinical practice over a century ago has now reached epidemic proportions, affecting millions of people who have absolutely no idea they're carrying borrowed trauma. Jung's concept of psychic infection has become a global reality. In our hyper-connected age, where emotional content spreads through social media, news cycles, and constant human interaction at speeds never before seen in human history, the boundaries between self and other have become dangerously permeable. Modern research confirms Jung's pioneering insights. Studies show that highly sensitive individuals, approximately 20% of the population, according to Dr. Elaine Aron's research, possess nervous systems that are neurologically predisposed to what Jung called emotional absorption. Their brains process sensory and emotional information more deeply, making them unconscious receptors for other people's unprocessed psychological content. But here's the tragic reality. Our culture has no framework for understanding this phenomenon. We have no psychological education about emotional boundaries, no training in what Jung called psychic hygiene, no awareness that feelings can be transmitted from person to person like invisible contagions. So people spend decades in therapy trying to heal emotions that don't even belong to them. They take medications for depression that stems from ancestral grief they've never consciously experienced. They struggle with anxiety that's actually their mother's unprocessed fear, panic attacks that carry their grandmother's terror, rage that belongs to their father's unlived life. The symptoms of emotional contamination are everywhere, hiding in plain sight. You feel inexplicably drained after social interactions, even with people you care about. Your emotional reactions seem disproportionate to your actual circumstances. You carry persistent sadness, anger, or fear with no clear personal origin. You might find yourself feeling responsible for other people's emotional states, compulsively trying to fix, heal, or manage their feelings. You experience sudden mood shifts that directly correlate with specific environments or individuals,